So my name is Micah. If you're not normally here at the meetings, just introduce myself. I run the music production program here at Seattle Pacific University. So I teach audio recording and live sound, that kind of thing. I'm a recording engineer as well, and so I'm very excited about this presentation because we're lucky to have Shawn Murphy and Nick Squire joining us from Boston this evening. Shawn Murphy is a recording engineer who was nominated for 3 Academy Awards and winning Best Sound in 1993 for Jurassic Park. Shawn has worked in over 350 feature films since 1983, including Jade, Jumanji, and Titanic. He has also built his reputation as a freelance mixer and audio supervisor for the Academy Awards, Boston Pops TV, PBS series, Saturday Night Live, the Boston Symphony Orchestra, which he's going to talk about today, Pacific Symphony Orchestra, Tanglewood Music Festival, and the Hollywood Bowl, to name a few. And joining him, we're very, very lucky to have Nick Squire. Nick Squire is a Grammy Award-winning recording engineer who has worked in the Boston area since 2011. In his current position as lead recording engineer at the Boston Symphony, he works with the Boston Symphony Orchestra, Boston Pops, Boston Symphony Chamber Players, among others. He earned his Bachelor of Music at University of Nebraska at Omaha and his Master of Music in Sound Recording at McGill, and he currently resides in Brookline, Massachusetts. Yes, so go ahead and take it from here, Nick and Shawn.
Thanks. And thanks for having us. A pleasure to be here. And thank you, everyone who chose to join in at whatever time it is for you. We're very lucky to have such a great audience. Just as a preface, we're going to speak a little bit about what we're doing now in Boston. The Boston Symphony has a hugely rich recording history. Lots of great recordings, great engineers have preceded us. And all of their work is stands alone as being top notch. But we, about 10 years ago, we embarked on a series of recordings with our new music director, Andres Nelsons. And we kind of developed a method of working, both the workflow and recording setup, which has turned out to be successful. And so the topic of tonight is basically that setup and what we're doing now. In terms of a little bit of history, we have a short introductory slideshow, which I can ask Nick to share here in a second. And just to show you Symphony Hall and give you a little bit of geography, where we are, what we're doing, and what the physical layout is. So.
Yep.
Nick.
And bear with me, I'm not a Zoom expert, so I'm going to be sharing screen and doing my best. And I'm here. I'm going to let Shawn sort of run the show, but I'm here for questions and any technical stuff. And anyway, happy to have everyone here with us.
Yeah, this is just in short. This is Nick's place. We're in his control room. He's the lead recording engineer for the BSO, and he is knows all of the ins and outs of the setup here, as well as being a great engineer. So I'm going to. So a little front piece. Here's an exterior, Symphony Hall. A lot of you know it. We have some pictures later to show, which is Symphony Hall right after it was built, which was 1900. It's one of the most famous acoustical venues in the world, modeled after Musikverein, Vienna and Amsterdam. And this and those two halls are considered to be the three best for orchestral acoustics in the world. They're not the only great halls in the world, of course, lots of great halls, but this one is special. It has remained pretty much untouched in 124 years since it opened. New stage floor went in 2006. I was here actually recording when the first orchestral sessions occurred. There's a shot of the inside of the hall from one of the balconies. The seating capacity is about 2,600 in symphony configuration. We often have stage extensions which reduce that number a little bit, but it's the largest of the three great acoustical halls. And it's the newest, with the acoustical design being done by Wallace Sabine, who was a Harvard professor at the time, and certainly one of the earliest and most notable applications of scientific acoustic design, modeled after other famous halls. So you can see a couple of wraparound balconies, large orchestra section, and an open stage platform with a large organ in the hall. Here's a shot from the back of the stage into the hall, so you can get a sense of the depth and the size of the space. It's about 100 feet from the stage to the rear wall of the audience. There are two seating configurations which we deal with in this hall. One is for symphony, and you saw that in the first slide. A couple slides down, we'll show you the POPs configuration, which is tables and chairs instead of seats on the main floor. And that reduces the seating capacity to about 2,300 and increases the noise level by about tenfold because of the audience eating and drinking. Here's another shot from the stage back to the empty hall. One thing you can see here on the back wall at the orchestra level, there are some diffusers, and Nick can probably point that out to the.
Let's see if you guys can see.
Yeah, can see there. Yeah. Now those are obviously were not there originally, and even in this configuration with the symphonic audience seating, there was a noticeable slap off of that back wall, and this mitigates that a bit because the down and back, is pretty close to 200 milliseconds, which is not great. And in fact, when the audience is filled with people, it's hardly noticeable. But when the hall is empty, and if you're recording in the hall when it's empty, it can be noticeable. And in some of the shots we'll show at the very end of the presentation, you see what was called the rehearsal drape, which was put up during rehearsals and recording sessions for many years to mitigate this very strong slap which emanated from that back wall. So this was a treatment that was done to mitigate that down and back slap when the hall is empty. So here's the POPs configuration and lighting. So you see tables and chairs in place of the seating. It's amazing how the place is transformed sometimes, and how flexible the room is in terms of doing all these different sorts of events. But there's you see a theatrical lighting and the tables and chairs. And then back to just a shot from below up to the stage. And an empty stage and an empty auditorium floor. So we have a few pictures coming up which show the recording setup prior to what we do now. We record all of these projects now with a live audience, and as all American orchestras do, the day of the separate session just for recording purposes is pretty much past. And the arrangement with the musicians is such that we are able to record in concert and use that material to manufacture commercial releases. But we show this because the flat floor, when we show you some pictures in a few minutes, is gonna show how they used to record in the hall, which is very different from what we do now. And there it is. That shows the orchestra on the auditorium floor, the chorus for an opera setup on the stage, and a lot of plywood and lighting strung out to manufacture a setting for commercial recording. And you can see a little bit of the overhead mic setups that were being used at the time. You can see the orchestra layout that was used. This sort of setup actually began in at least the 50s, if not earlier. And we have pictures showing it as late as the 1980s and 90s that this was done. And here's another one, a similar situation with the orchestra on the auditorium floor and a large chorus up on the stage. So here's just a stage layout on the auditorium floor, again showing the plywood reflectors. And I think the plywood reflectors were mostly to keep the early reflections pretty present for the orchestra, because underneath the balconies on the sides, you would tend to get slaps, which would be less desirable. And that you can see in some of the pictures later that the plywood was tilted a little bit, so it wasn't squared up. And this is a sort of setup for the orchestra that we see quite often in these archival pictures. Okay, so we're in a control room now, which was originally built, it was referred to as the DG room. And this is the new version of the DG room. If you can go back one, Nick. This is the original plans for the DG room, which with the new control room inserted, and it shows you that they originally were non-parallel walls in this room. It was used as a control room originally, probably in the 50s and 60s. I can get the blueprint date, but it sat in that configuration for many years, and then later was used by Sony and RCA and many other engineers in its previous form. And now we have a new control room, which was built in 2015.
Yep.
John Stork was the acoustical designer, and that's where we are now. There's a basic picture of our room. We're very fortunate to have a great control room to work in. There's a couple of shots just showing you the side, and here is kind of the way it is right now. We took this picture just yesterday. So it shows you a producer position, the engineer position, screens which are programmable to show either pyramid sessions or various cameras in the auditorium. There's a second engineer position to the left and rear of the producer, showing the machine operation. There's a little submix down on the right, which is basically for utility purposes and for radio broadcasts that emanate from this room. I saw someone ask about speakers. They are PNW 802 version 2s, Class A amplifiers. The room recently, in the last year, was set up for Atmos, which is a 714 configuration. So the B&Ws in front, B&Ws on the side and rear, and Neumann's on the top, Howard Neumann's on the top. We're being asked to provide Atmos versions of most of our commercial releases now, so we figured we'd better get ourselves set up to do it ourselves rather than having to go elsewhere. A little closer look at the mixing. It's a desk. It's a Yukon setup with S1s, 4 S1s. We previously, for a long time, had S3s, and so there's a little closer look at the monitors. The S1 monitor controller here is a Grace 908, which also works as speaker management. And Nick can talk a little bit more about how that's set up in a second. And so it's just giving you kind of a general layout of our workspace. Yep. Nick will take it from here.
So I'll try and give a quick overview of sort of the technical back end stuff. So we're using Pyramix as our primary DAW to record tracks. In tandem with that, we have multiple Horaces acting as sort of preamps and conversion, and also sort of what we use to derive Ravenna signals. So we're using audio over IP, specifically Ravenna, which is, if some of you might not be familiar with, it's very similar to Dante. It's just slightly different. And what this allows us to do is to have, we have kind of 4 Horaces in our current configuration with a 5th as a spare, kind of situated throughout the building, one up towards the attic, one under the stage, one in the control room, and one as a floater to get additional signals as needed. And all of these allow us to sort of put preamps closer to microphones, so we don't have as long of copper cables from the mics to the preamps. And then from there spits out Cat6 cables that run into network switches, and that's we're able to send signals around the building via audio over IP to all the recording machines. We're able to send signals back, mixes or stems or any feeds we need throughout the building over audio over IP, which is really convenient and makes things a lot easier than it used to be. So the pictures you're seeing now are just some quick pictures I took. These aren't 100% current, but they're within the last couple of years. There are 3 pictures here. It's kind of hard to see, but the one on the left is under the stage in what we call the amp room. You can see a Horus kind of on the left. Below that are some Grace preamps, 802 preamps. We, in our current configuration, have 112 channels of preamps, 40 of those being Graces and the rest being merging preamps. And then you can see some other infrastructure here, patch bays and amplifiers for live sound equipment. The middle picture is our rack up in the attic. Again, similar setup. We've got a Horus with a number of Graces, some reverb units, and a lot of cables. The picture on the right is in our machine room, a couple computers, again, another Horus, and some additional equipment that we use for broadcast and video signal distribution. So as we start getting into talking about our current setup, Symphony, as Shawn mentioned, Symphony Hall's quite old. It was built quite a while ago in 1899 or 1900, something like that.
Right.
The infrastructure you can feel it. I mean, it's not a modern hall, so often there's a lot of compromises. I think there's been a lot done to these spaces to make them easier to work compared to when I talked to people that have worked here many years ago. So I think we're lucky, but that being said, it is still difficult to work in these spaces. You can see the kind of raked floor on the left. This is above the stage. And there are holes in the floor that go down, penetrate through, and go down to the stage floor, kind of in a 3-foot by 3-foot grid, which gives us quite a bit of flexibility to position mics above the stage. And then we also pull those back with fishing string to the organ loft. The picture on the right is an area sort of above where the seats are. And we often will hang most of our sort of main system mics or Decatrees and wides and string fills and any hall or surround or Atmos mics sort of further out, and then pull those in with fishing line from the rope loft, because we have these multiple stage extensions I'm going to talk about this in more detail, but you can see this picture shows a stage extension. So we have the thick black line here is the regular stage. And then there's a stage extension, 5.5-foot stage extension. There's an additional 11-foot stage extension and then an additional 13.5 stage extension. So in every day, we might have a number of different groups come in to record. And so we might be setting up 2 different orchestras in a single day. And one might be, even though the orchestration and the setup is very similar, they might be 11 feet positioned differently on the stage. So we'll have to move, pretty much every single mic, to make it work with their setup. I don't know, Shawn, do you want to dig into the microphone setup that we're currently using?
Yeah, I think the thing to add that may be obvious, maybe not in terms of stage extensions, is this hall was designed for the orchestra to be on the permanent stage. A lot of works that we record and perform now were written after the hall was built, and they're larger and require more space than what is available on the stage, especially large choral works or some modern works. So the stage extensions become a factor a lot of the time. And whether it's 5, 11, or 13 feet, all of those extensions move the orchestra out of the acoustic envelope that was originally designed. And that actually affects our recording setup and technique quite a bit, because what winds up on the 4 stage inevitably is strings. And what needs the most support from the acoustical shell is the strings. So it changes our approach in terms of microphones. It changes our approach in terms of coverage and mixing. And you know, it doesn't mean we'll necessarily use all of it, but depending on the work and depending on the seating, it does affect kind of our approach to the recording. And because we're on stage extensions probably 80% of the time,
Yeah,
I would say,
definitely.
you know, and it's just the way of the world right now in terms of you know, being on that extension. I think this is
This is
is
the
the-
Shostakovich
right.
15
So-
setup from 2019.
Right. So a little later, we're going to play actually a little bit of the first movement from Shostakovich 15. This is the setup for that recording. And I think Nick can point out the microphone locations.
Sure.
And this is the seating that was that we recorded in terms of to replicate this setup if we needed to.
So there are green circles and there are red circles. The green are hanging mics, and the red circles are mics that are on the deck on stands.
Right.
Just to
Right. So you can see a tree that's over the podium. I'm reluctant to call it a deca tree because deca tree kind of denotes M50s, and these are not M50s. It's a tree in that configuration. So there's a tree. There are a pair of what we call surround mics that are directly behind it. And then there's a pair of hall mics that are further out in the hall. And then, like in a deca setup, there are flanking outriggers, whether you call them outriggers or string boosters or whatever you choose to call them, that's what they are. And then we have additional string fills, and you can see those hanging mics above the celli, the violas, the second violins, and the first violins. So those are usually in the second row back from the front of the section, and they're optional for us to use if need be. That's part of the technique of dealing with the stage extensions, adding some string fills if we need them. Over the woodwinds, we typically hang 3 mics left, center, right. Occasionally, it becomes 4 mics if it's a very large section. The interesting part of that is they're figure-8 mics and they're facing almost directly down. They're usually over the front row of woodwinds facing the back row, and that becomes our primary woodwind pickup almost all the time. There's a bass section mic hanging. There are percussion mics that are hanging, and percussion, of course, changes with all these different works. So depending on if we have a predominant mallet instrument, we might mic it in stereo. If we have a lot of toys, we might mic that in stereo from overhead. You know, it depends on the rig. For this particular piece, there are some mallets that are mic'd in stereo and some in mono. And then on the right side, stage left, is the tuba mic, and we typically fly that. So that's the hanging rig. And then on the floor, we have principal strings, first, second, viola, cello, and principal bass. Those are basically for solos in tight. Then we depending on the woodwind setup, we will put mics on stands in front of different woodwind players if we anticipate a solo that might need to be separately boosted in the mix. Again, they're optional and they're often not used. Pair of mics on the French horns from the front. Pair of mics on trumpets and trombones. Again, often not used. Set of mics on the timpani, left and right, and a mic on the bass drum. And then in this particular work, there's a celeste, which is mic'd separately. And those are the deck mics for this piece we're going to listen to. So this is going to be hard to see, I think. And Nick, I think, has a version of this that we can actually.
Yeah, if you guys are having trouble seeing this, I can pull up the actual spreadsheet as opposed to a screenshot. But I don't know, it is maybe readable.
Yeah, it basically is the setup of channels, microphones, preamp gains. I think it has delays on it as well.
Yeah.
We delay all the spot mics, which is pretty common these days, into the main rig. So this is kind of the Bible for the setup for this. And it might be good to pull up the bigger version.
Yeah, we can later if anybody wants to see it.
If that would be okay, we at the end of this slideshow, we can pull that up and take a closer look at it. I think it might be interesting.
And there's someone in chat. Thanks for the for that said I like all the detail in the input list. What I try to achieve is we want to obviously document what has been done, but if we ever did need to recall or we're doing a similar setup, we can easily see what we did and recreate it very easily. Additionally, putting in a spreadsheet allows, I mean, this is just Excel stuff, but it's easy to spit out different views of the same material. So anyway, it's makes life easier for us as we're setting up.
Right. So we'll take a closer look at this and actually can maybe go down the whole list and just talk about microphones. And here's another.
So same information, just a different view.
Right.
Essentially.
Right.
Should we go to pictures of this setup?
Yeah. So now we have some pictures of the microphones on the stage, and I will apologize ahead of time because these are going to be hard to see because they're small mics and nobody wants to see them. So we go out and take a picture, and it's you're looking at, and of course the management would love to see no microphones. So they're mostly small capsule condensers. They're mostly on collect cables or on low profile stands, and they're meant to not be seen. So the effort of taking pictures and showing them we've tried several times to get better shots, and this is what we wound up with.
And these are pictures from the setup of the excerpts that we're going to play you from 2019. But we do have later, there's some better shots that are lighted differently that we took this morning. The different setup, but obviously similar technique.
So the stage plan that we were looking at earlier that were the microphones, this is the setup. Yeah. This is the setup. And there's a front view of it.
Yeah, it's really hard to see the mics. I'm going to go to our current, this is from this morning. We're doing a different project, but the lighting was a little bit better and you can sort of see the microphones.
Yeah, I don't know if you can put a cursor on them just so you can see. There's a side view of the tree. It's basically over the podium. Again, apologize for the difficulty in seeing. We'll page through a couple of these and you can sort of. This is looking upward. When we go down the mic list, we'll show the main tree mics in this setup are Sennheiser 8020s. We went through when we first started doing these recordings in 2014, I guess it was. Yeah. We tried a bunch of different rigs. Obviously, Shep's 2Hs, Neumann, DPA, all the usual customers. And for this orchestra in this hall, for the kind of sound we were looking for, the Sennheiser 8020s really were the best, the most flattering view of the orchestra that we tried. Not that any of the others weren't good. They were all good. It was just what we were looking for.
This is just an interesting shot, sort of standing on the conductor's podium looking up. You can see the mic cable sort of draping in, and you can see a few holes in the attic where we're able to drop, and then we sort of pull them in again using fishing string to the organ loft.
Right. So here's a little better shot, and Nick can put the cursor on where the actual there's the left, center, and right tree again over the podium, and looking up at the tree from the podium and up to the side. Maybe go back one just to see. Just so you can kind of get a sense of the spacing. It's pretty much a classic spacing. And then from the side, you can sort of see one of the flanking the outriggers there. In this setting now, the outriggers we're using are MKH 800 twins. It's a nice thing to use a twin in this setting because it gives you pattern control post-production. And being the fact that we're on a stage extension, it gives you the ability to focus those mics as string boosters using a cardioid pattern or even a hypercardioid pattern or a figure 8 pattern, as opposed to a mic that's creating more space, which might be an omni or a subcardioid. So we have the ability in post-production to vary the pattern using those twins on the left and right outriggers, which is very useful.
You can also see in this picture the stage extension. So where the cursor is sort of where the proscenium ends. And the actual stage ends in front of where the conductor's podium is here. Then the orchestra is set up right now on the 5.5-foot extension. And then there's an additional 5.5 set up, which was used for a different event. So this in total is 11 feet beyond what was the hall was originally designed for, which is interesting.
Right, right.
You can see the surround mics up here as well, hopefully.
Yep, they're just visible. Yep.
Okay.
Here's a look from basically in just in front of the podium. It shows the principal string mics, which are Sheps on Colette tubes, and then looking back at the podium into the hall, and you can kind of see the tree. You can point to the tree above.
And you can see the surrounds behind
it. The
surrounds
behind it a little bit. The surround mics are Neumann 133s, a bright Omni, they still have spheres on them,
yep,
right?
With spheres
on them, yeah. Bright Omnis, because we're looking back at the hall. We're having I'm a kind of a believer in when you get into those distances of having a brighter mic for your ambience, because you're pretty far into the reverberant field at that point.
And for this, we were listening to rehearsals this morning. There's what we call a conductor spy mic there in the center of the shot, just so we can hear the conductor when he calls out rehearsal numbers or is talking to the orchestra.
Right. So there are the woodwind overheads, which are the Neumann AK-20 capsules, which are figure eights. We've tried a lot of different figure eights. This is, figure eights over the woodwind it's not unheard of. It's not uncommon, but we like this pickup. It really retains the balances of the wind players very truthfully, and so we're not chasing balances very much when we're in this configuration. Just positioning them properly, it takes a little time, but once you get that, it's a really flattering picture of the winds. We've tried, Sennheiser 800s. We've tried Sheps MK8s. We've tried,
41s.
41. Yeah. We've tried a lot of things over the winds, and these Neumann AK-20s seem to be the best to our ears. And then we put spot mics down for woodwind solos if needed. And they're on stands, and you can see them. They're sort of, I would say typically these are for English horn, maybe bass clarinet, contrabassoon, occasionally for flute and clarinet, not too often. It depends on the piece, and it depends on how because of the delays, we're not really making them louder. We're making them more present when we mix these spot mics in, because the delays keep it from overcoming the main picture. Pair mics on the timpani.
Maybe before we go there were some questions about heights, and I apologize, we're not able to see the input list, and that sort of takes a while to digest, but maybe we could just kind of talk through the setup in a little more detail real quick.
Sure. Yeah.
So the decketry, we're usually at 10.5 feet. Our outriggers are usually at 9.5 feet. And our string fills are usually at between 7 and 7.5 feet, depending. Woodwinds were usually around 8 or a little less, maybe 7.
8 or a little less. Yeah.
And then, some of the auxiliary hanging mics are usually probably around 7 feet, 7.5 feet. Surrounds are a little bit higher, a little bit further back. And then we're starting to do Atmos setups as well. And that's sort of the box of Omnis above the orchestra.
Which are 2 H's.
Yeah, 2 H's pointing straight up.
Yeah, pointing upward, right? So it's basically a square approach on the Atmos tops.
Yeah. So hopefully that's a decent overview.
Yeah.
I'll go to this score picture, Shawn.
Right. Yeah, it's just a quick indicator. This is just a score page kind of showing markings for different performances. I use a color code because it can quickly mark which performances are good, circling things which are not good. The color tells you which performance it is. whether it's a not together, which is, I use railroad tracks, you circle something that's maybe not together or not in tune, or where a note is missed or it doesn't sound right. Just a quick shorthand to indicate, quickly in live performance. You can always go back and play back later and make more detailed notes and edit plans, which we do. So, but it's good to get a good sense, because when we're doing these live performances, we may have 3 or 4 performances, and we need to know by the end of those performances whether we need to do a patch session. Patch sessions take place here after the final performance, and sometimes that can be at midnight or later, and nobody wants to be here. So you have to put a very concise list together very quickly of what needs to be fixed that wasn't covered in the public performances that were already recorded. So quick markings are very helpful. So maybe
I'm going to stop sharing, and maybe the question is if we should take some questions now.
Yeah, I think
play some excerpts.
Yeah, I think now would be great for questions if people wanted to jump in and because there are probably some things we haven't clarified and some good questions, and Nick can also pull up the input list and we can look at that in more detail.
People who've asked a question can go ahead. Oh, you can't unmute yourself. Hold on.
I could just go through the chat and try, and we could give some quick answers real quick, or what do you think?
Sure. Yeah, do you want to do that? Can you see that?
I can, yeah.
Nick is looking at the chat, yeah.
So we're going back kind of in time here, but yeah, PNW speakers, I think Shawn already answered this.
Right.
802s. What digital format are you using with the Horus? Well, we're spitting out Ravenna, but the Horus also we're using it with MADI as well, and AES. So we're kind of using it all, depending on who and how we're using it.
The thing to say about the Horus setup is the house PA front end is Digico in this setting, and everything runs at 96K in this system. And a lot of times we need to trade symphony mics to the PA and PA mics to the symphony if you're doing a pop show or something like that, where you have a solo performer and it's going to be recorded. So Nick has a method of getting kind of cross patching internally so that all of those mics are available.
Yep.
So if the PA needs to take chorus mics that are really recording mics, they can do that. If Nick needs to take vocal mics that are part of the PA, he can do that. So maybe a quickie explanation of how that's done.
Yeah. Well, it's just we're just sending MADI back and forth. So we have 112 channels of preamps in sort of recording world, and Live Sound has an additional 112 channels in a PA world, and so I can
256 channel SD racks, right? Yeah. Okay.
So with MADI, we can easily just at a click of a button, I have access to all of 112 of theirs, and we can send all 112 of ours front of house console as needed via MADI. Let's see. Is there a reverb chamber in the hall? What is the master clock? What was the motivating factor with Ravenna versus Dante? No reverb chamber outside of the hall itself.
The hall itself, but we'll talk about reverb in a second, because there is a reverb element that we use. But the hall, listen, this hall is a very flattering place. It's not an environment that hurts you at all. It's vastly different when it's empty than when it's full. I mentioned that earlier, and we were talking about this earlier. It's not so much the reverb time changes, of course, when it's empty versus when it's full. The seats don't compensate. But the difference more than the reverb time is the reverb intensity. The reverb level and intensity when it's empty is a lot more intrusive than when it's full. And we have to cope with that in terms of both the mic positions and the perspectives and how much subsidiary miking we use versus how much main miking we use, because we try as much as possible to lean on the main mics, but depending on the size of the audience, the reverb in the hall, and the piece we're recording, that changes. So back to Nick.
Master clock. I've currently got a Rosendahl NanoSync as the master clock. Motivating factor to go with Ravenna versus Dante. We've invested quite heavily in sort of merging hardware, and merging is very much Ravenna based. Sort of Ravenna has a lot of capabilities and pros that make it worth going that way versus Dante. That could be a long discussion if we start to go down that road, so I'll just leave it there. Let's see. We talked about the input list a little bit. Spot mic delay. Yeah, I typically measure from the more or less the middle of the tree, so somewhere between the center and the left and right. My reasoning behind that is there are so many, the math is so complex that I don't think it is going to matter too much. You have the height, you have a lot of, the X, Y, and Z axes make it very difficult to measure. So I think there was a question about measuring delays. I usually do an impulse just underneath the tree, and we record that and measure that impulse on all the individual microphones, and then we can, in Pyramix, measure each one and record that and set it accordingly. Is it as accurate as doing it the other way, which is, doing an impulse in front of the mic and then measuring it to the tree? It isn't, but when you are typically doing setups with 80, 90 or more microphones, it's just from the time to do that. It's much easier to do it once as opposed to 90 times on an entire setup. So that's why I do it that way. Talked about that. Width and length of the hall, do you know off the top of your head, Shawn?
I know that the depth from the stage to the back wall is right about 100 feet. The width I don't know offhand. I could probably find that out.
It's probably on Wikipedia. We should know, but we don't know. Mics and setup for organ as solo and with the orchestra. Well, we don't record it as a solo instrument very often. With orchestra, it's tricky, and jump in if you want to.
Well, we've tried a lot of, the interesting thing, the organ is basically part of the stage wall, the rear wall, and it's a large organ. And often, omnidirectional mics are desirable for organs because of the great low end. But what happens, of course, if you start backing away from the organ when the orchestra is playing, you wind up getting orchestra and organ.
Mm-hmm.
You're not able to isolate the organ very well. And so we've tried a couple of different things, and we have one setup where the mics are quite close in the organ. And there are multiple, I think 4 is what we wound up with at one point. In addition to, of course, main mics that are out front that hear the organ. And if you're looking at it for an ensemble with organ, that works great. If you're looking for detail in the organ, you go with something a little closer. It's a great sounding instrument, and it's just one of those things where there's virtually no acoustical separation between the orchestra on the stage and the organ. They're in the same space.
Cool. Anything special in the hall for Atmos versus over the orchestra? Yep, so we have surround mics that are a little bit behind the decketry. Additionally, there's further out in the hall, there's mics, omni mics that we pan in the rear channels as well, in addition to the height channels. Hopefully that answers that question. All omnis.
The attitude here on the Atmos mixes is that it's a classical presentation, and it's static. We don't move things around. We establish a sound picture that we're happy with, front versus tops and sides and rears, and that stays the same through the piece. Obviously, when we do film score Atmos and things like that, it's a much different thing, because a lot of times composers will actually have elements that they'd like to move around and things that lend themselves to that Atmos approach. But for classical music in this hall, it's a static event.
Our good friend Charlie Post asks,
hi Charlie.
How does one advocate for patch sessions?
Well, it's a great question. Of course, what happens is the personnel manager starts hovering over my shoulder at about halfway through the work, saying, do we need a patch? Do we need a patch? Do we need a patch? Because they'd rather not. It's expensive, and it's time consuming, and often it's the middle of the night, so nobody wants to do it. sometimes I know we need a patch before the last performance because because of the way it's being played consistently, you know it. But in fact, I try to create a list as I go. And, after the first performance, there's a list. The second performance, there's a list that's maybe a little bit smaller because they're covering things. The third performance, there's another list where they covered more. And if you're lucky, by that time, they've covered everything. And you cross it all off the list and say, okay. But if you get to that point, you turn around and say, I think we're going to need one. They're in 15-minute increments. I don't think we've ever needed more than a half an hour. Typically, we do the whole patch in 10 or 15 minutes because we're calling out, finite bits of the score which need to be played, and they've just done it. So the thing is, the players all know when we ask for a patch in a certain bar, they know why. So it's never politically, no one's ever happy to do a patch session. It's one of those things where we do it because we just absolutely don't have it anywhere else.
Cool. Bitrate and sampling frequency. We're recording at 96 kilohertz and 24 bits typically. We have done some projects at 192K.
We did some projects at 192, and we do our post-production at 32-bit. But the original recording doesn't need to be more than 24.
Do you capture all mic channels separately, or is there a mix being done live? Both. So all of the mics that we have out on stage, we record individually, full multi-track, so we can go back in post-production and remix and edit and have full control over the mix. That being said, we are doing a live mix as the concerts are happening. So we can hear what it's hopefully close to what it's going to sound like.
Right.
B, so the musicians can listen afterwards, or the soloists or the conductor, after the concert, to get a sense of how it went. We also do live radio broadcasts here with our great friends from WCRB. Big shout out to Antonio and Brian.
Right. And I think mention the fact also that the musicians can go online and hear. They have a password protected link that they can go on and they can at home listen to the performances.
Yeah, that's been, I think, a big help for the orchestra musicians. A few years back, I set up a basically streaming server for the musicians that have a login, and about 30 minutes after every concert, we have the recording uploaded, and then musicians sometimes, even on their drive home from the concert hall, can listen to that performance from that night in order to sort of help them prepare for the next day's concert and see how it went, and hopefully make the performance better.
Yeah. I should note right now that, aside from the obvious that we're dealing with one of the world's great orchestras and also a great bunch of people in terms of just our personal relationship with the players, which is wonderful. The players take a lot of interest in these recordings and come down and visit us, and we do playbacks for them. They listen online, especially in terms of soloistic or individual performances, and we get feedback from them a lot in terms of which concert was best for which section of the piece, and we take note of that and try to address that in the editorial plan. So it becomes more, it's not just us deciding, it's a collaboration with the players, and more than a lot of orchestras, they do take part. They come down and participate, which is really great. It's very beneficial for us.
Next question. How do you mix the paired spot mics in terms of panning if you have a stereo pair, for example?
Right. We try to put the panning pretty close to the seating, I think for obvious reasons, because the main pickup is going to show that. So the paired spots, like on the French horns or like on the trombones or trumpets, are not panned very wide. We try to maybe emphasize the side of the stage they're on a little bit, so that in the stereo picture there's clear delineation. And one of the things that helps us in the mix, but with the delays and on spot mics, is to pan things in a way that in the audio space they are separated enough so that you can hear them clearly. So having said that, they're not panned very wide, but they are panned about where they're sitting may be a little exaggerated. You know, the woodwinds, for instance, you know, the left and right side of the woodwind overheads might be at left and right 60, you know, that sort of thing. And the center's up the center, of course. That is an example.
Mm-hmm. There's a question. Are you guys too young to have recorded Charles Munch? Definitely for me.
Yeah. But you know, listen, some of those are just great recordings, and so, there are the archive here is great, and they have pictures of a lot of those setups, and most of them were done on the auditorium floor, with the hall empty, and they're done in sessions, and so that's the acoustic that you're hearing in those recordings.
Next question. Do you operate at two different sample rates simultaneously? That is DXD for commercial while taking lower res MADI for the complete inputs. We're only doing PCM. We're not doing DXD here, but we do sometimes have to operate at multiple sample rates because we do a radio broadcast. We've upgraded our equipment, so we don't have to do this anymore. But previously, we were doing 96K recordings on the multi-track. But then all the radio broadcast equipment was at 48K. So we're sort of operating in two sample rates simultaneously with conversions and kind of keeping everything in sync. Do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, we're all at 96 now. There's a separate, radio uses this control room that you can see us sitting in if it's available, but there's another control room in the hall that radio can use if we're busy down here. So if we're doing a commercial recording, we do it in this room, the new control room, and radio uses the secondary control room. The access to the Pyramix rigs and the audio is the same either way. It's just obviously it's a smaller room, and it's more of a controlled booth as opposed to a nice luxurious control room. But the audio capability in the hall, and as Nick said, the fact that we have a great radio crew, we have great reinforcement people we work with. Nick has an associate, Cole Barber, who's also a McGill person, who is one of our regular engineers who is with us all the time. So we actually have a lot of support and a lot of great people to work with.
Yeah, really good team. Next question: how do you deal with the different reverb intensity when you do a patch session?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's where having the ability to change perspectives or match perspectives with things like the twins on the outriggers and the ability to use a little more or a little less of the hanging spots comes into play, because what we'll explain, well, we can explain it now or later, is that we do add reverb to the spot mics, because obviously a spot mic alone is going to have very little reverb. It's going to be in very close, and we want to try to match as much as possible the hall. So we have reverb settings that match the hall, where we can kind of blend the spot mics into it, along with the delays, make it hopefully pretty invisible that we're using the spots and we're using anything other than the hall. But yes, there is electronic reverb, and it's Brocastian lexicon. It's all very standard stuff, nothing very exotic, but we use it very judiciously, and certainly not on everything at the same level or the same intensity. But matching the hall empty and full is a great question, and that's an issue we deal with.
So I'm wondering, and Dan, maybe you can weigh in. The questions keep rolling in, which is fabulous, and I think we're going to answer all of them. But should we pause and listen to some music real quick, or keep going on questions?
I think we should put up the
input list. Sure.
So I think, because a lot of people might be interested in just what mics wound up on what instruments, and the input list has all that in great detail. So we do that, and then maybe think about playing back some material.
Yeah, I think you should do what you want to here.
Yeah. How are we doing time-wise? Are we okay?
Doing great, yeah.
Okay.
Just barely over an hour.
Okay, so I'll let Nick walk you through this input list, because it kind of shows everything. It comprehensively describes what we're doing.
Let me make that a little bit bigger. Cool. So hopefully this is a little bit easier for everyone to see. So kind of going back over, we've talked about a little a little of this, but just going from the top. So essentially, we've got 3 LCR woodwinds of Neumann 120s. Gain for this particular recording was about 7 feet 10 inches.
Excuse me, Nick, can you zoom in just a little bit, make it 150% maybe or something? Because there's a lot of stuff on the right that we don't necessarily, there you go, a little
That's
more.
true.
Maybe?
That's true.
Yeah.
How's that?
That's better, isn't it? Yeah.
Yes, definitely better.
Okay, good idea. As we mentioned earlier, a couple stand mics on the woodwinds. In this case, they were Shep's MK4s, cardioids. There's a couple these piano mics. So obviously, when we're doing a commercial recording, we might be recording a Shostakovich symphony, but there's certainly other pieces on the program. So we're doing archival recordings of other pieces while doing commercial recordings of whatever we're focusing on. So that week we must have been doing some sort of piano concerto. I don't remember what.
I don't remember what it was, but
it was 4006s. And then as Shawn mentioned before, we're using the MKH twins for outriggers or wides, however you want to call them. Typically we're at 9.5 feet for those. Decatree are Sennheiser 8020s at 10.5 feet. And the width is usually left and right is about 5 feet.
about 50
And
inches, right?
Yep, 60 inches. And to the front is maybe 38 inches.
Around 38. Yep. That's a pretty standard setup. Yep.
Moving on, there's 2 Celeste mics, Shep's MK21s on a stereo bar, or they might have been actually a little further spaced, couple feet off the ground, just close to try and pick up the Celeste. String principal mics, looks like a combination for this recording were MKH 8090s, the wide cards, or Shep's MK21s. These are probably 3 or 4 feet off the ground, just sort of peeking over the principal string player music desks.
Yeah, my recollection on this particular piece was that actually the principal violin, principal cello did have solos, and we elected to go with the Sennheisers because they were a little warmer and they were more flattering. So I think we switched out those 2. They're all subcardioids, but they're just a little different character.
Bass principal mic, AKG 414. That's probably about 2 or 3 feet off the floor, sort of underneath the music stand, pretty close up to the principal bass player. Bass hanging mic for the section. In this case, it was a MK41 supercardioid at 7 feet. And then the other string section mics, MK4s, Shep's MK4s at, I like to do the violin sections at 7.5 feet and then the low strings at 7 feet, just to attempt to get more strings than trombones. It doesn't always, doesn't always work, but we attempt.
Yeah.
Surrounds in this case, like we talked about, were the Neumann 133s with the spheres at roughly 15 feet. Hall mics further back that we end up using for our Atmos rears, 4006s. Horn mics were Shep's MK21s. These are on stands, probably 3 or 4 feet high, in front of the horns. Pair of MK5s on trumpets. Pair of MK5s on trombones. Tuba was a MKH 8040, hanging in the air at about 8.5 feet. Bass drum was a Neumann 133, an Omni mic, pretty close to the backside of the head. For this recording, we had the timpani mics, MK41s on stands on either sides of the drums, but the last couple of years we've been hanging them.
Yeah.
And a bunch of percussion mics, combination of Neumann 184s and MKH 8050s, as you guys can see. Probably
I think the
around
8050s might have been a stereo pair, I think, in this case.
Probably.
Yeah.
Cool. I'm not watching chat, but Is there any specific questions? Let me pull chat up. I can't see chat when I'm sharing here.
Yeah, have to jump out of the share.
There we go.
Yeah,
Um,
address any specific setup.
And Dan,
items.
if you've seen any questions that are related to this, if you want to chime in, feel free.
The one I'm looking at now is how do you control timpani bleed in the horn mics? And
Yeah.
trumpet and percussion and et cetera.
Yeah, timpani's everywhere. And the way to control timpani bleed is to have a good timpani player. Someone who actually plays good dynamics and chooses sticks that are not gonna excite the entire stage. And we're lucky in that regard. We have a player who's sensitive and who understands dynamics. You can see the mic choices are somewhat an effort to exclude the timpani, but you know, when the horns are sitting right in front of them, you know, the sound is horns and timpani by definition. You know, we all it's a road we're all going down in terms of how the seating works and whether the best seating for concert is the best seating for recording. And sometimes the answer is no, but you have to deal with the concert seating because it's a live performance, and that's what the conductor and the players are used to. So so we choose, as much as we can, we choose microphones, and we try to influence the seating if we can to get the best possible pickup. But it's absolutely a good question in terms of, you know, what about timpani bleed? Well, as Nick said, what about trumpets and trombones into viola mics? You know, they're right there. You know, they're where what you know, it's a trombone and viola mic.
Yeah, I think that, and certainly the key is to use, if you're able to use mics that have very good off-axis response,
Right,
because everything's getting everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, and the Sennheisers are good. The Sheps, as we all know, are great in that department. They are great off-axis. Yeah, I mean, the issue of seating and leakage is one we could talk about all night. You know, it's a great topic, actually.
All right, should I just jump back into the questions, Dan? What do you think?
I think
Sure. Like I say, we have no plan here. This is for you to do what you want. So anything you want is great.
Questions, and
Okay.
then we'll play a few tracks here.
Okay, great. So I'm just going to try and hopefully pick up where we left off. But if I missed anybody's questions, add it in the bottom. But I'm going back a little bit here. Let's see. Hall's RT60 for full versus empty.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because probably it's a little over 2 seconds empty and a little under 2 seconds full. But that doesn't really explain the difference because it's the intensity of the reverb versus the time that changes the most when it's full versus empty.
Yeah. There's a question here. How much freedom do you have in the technique to use? Is it your technical idea for each musical piece, or do you have to comply, adapt to artists, producers' requests?
You know, we are fortunate in that even though these recordings are released by DG, which is a Universal Music, the actual production is the BSO, and Nick is the BSO engineer, and I'm the producer of this series of recordings and engineer along with Nick. So so long as our artists are happy and our record company is happy, we do what we want. You know, the approach to these recordings has been one that we want to hear. We want to take advantage of the hall, which is great, but we want to hear, you know, all the detail and precision in the playing that we can, while maintaining space and depth and a beautiful picture, obviously, because we have a beautiful orchestra. So you know, we are able to do what we want so long as everybody's happy with the results. And I laughingly say, well, if you're not happy with what we do, you hire somebody else, and that's the bottom line. You know, we try our best to make ourselves happy first, and then hopefully our musician friends and management are happy as well.
Yeah. Okay, here's another question about the seats, asking if they're original. They are original seats. Certainly they've been fixed and you know, as materials break down, they've
Right,
been fixed,
right.
but it's the original design.
It's the original design. And as I said earlier, the only thing that has changed significantly is they put a new stage floor in, because the old stage floor was just basically had been worn down to the point where it was not stable. So they put a new stage floor in, and they did a lot of research to get the wood from the same place as the original wood, and the installation, it was exactly the same, and you know, everything was done to make it as identical as possible, and I think it was identical, but of course it changed the sound, because you had in one case a stage floor that was at that point over 100 years old, and now you have a brand new stage floor where the thickness is different, back to the original thickness. And what we found, I did a lot of pops recordings from the late 80s on to the early part of the 2000s, and we were doing a pops recording right after the stage floor was redone. And we all felt that it was more lively and bright sounding in a good way. It wasn't a big negative at all. I think everybody noticed the difference, but it was kind of, you know, like, okay, it's a bit more lively, it's a little bit brighter. And it's all, you know, good musical ingredients caused by the stage floor replacement. So that's the big difference. Everything else in the hall is pretty much the same.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, we're downstairs, we're underneath the hall in the control room, and the hallway outside our room is pretty much the same. You know?
Here's another question. How long to transform from full seating to bare floor or tables? They bring in, I would say it's probably 12 hours-ish, I think. I hope I'm close with that. They bring in a huge crew of, I don't know, 20 or 30 people. And usually we have such a quick turnaround between seasons, from symphony season to pop season,
right.
that they kind of come in and start and they work overnight, and we can be setting up for pops almost the day or 2 days after we finish our symphony season. So they do it pretty quick.
Right.
There's an elevator in the floor we're under the seats. So they remove some seats, and then they can get the seats into the basement using that elevator,
Right.
which is kind of neat.
And they do that conversion at least twice a year, because the pops do a spring season, which starts in May and goes through part of June, and then they do a Christmas season as well. So they go back and forth from symphony seating to pop seating at least twice every year.
And if anybody is interested, I think if you search on YouTube, there's some time lapse videos of the floor being changed over, if anybody's actually interested in that. Another question here for does the line array live there all the time? It does at the moment. There's been different years. We used to bring it, you know, only put it up for programs that needed it and would take it down. These days, I think there's a push to have, you know, when we're doing pieces with living composers, to have the composers come on stage and introduce it, or have the conductor introduce a program before the concert starts. And so they have a wireless mic, and it needs to be amplified, obviously, so the audience can hear. So these days, we're leaving the PA, the line arrays up basically for every program. Because of that, there might be someone that comes up on stage and speaks.
Right. And they do pre-concert events for every Masterworks series. So there's frequently a guest person coming in and talking about the works, and they might do some playbacks. So yeah, the line arrays stay up. They're obviously not used at all in our world, but they're there all the time.
Okay, next question. I've seen many advocate for a near coincident pairs over using a decatree with ensembles. Can you elaborate on why you prefer using a decatree over or TF, NOS, CBS, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's just probably my background and my preferences. In film score recording, which I do a lot of, space mics work better than coincident mics historically. In terms of filling the screen, we've always found that a space mic setup is more advantageous in terms of if you're filling a 40 or 60-foot screen, and outriggers as well. And so I've come to like that pickup, the space mics. Of course, I like M50s, but in our setting here, We don't use any tube type mics at all in live performance. You can't really afford the possibility of something failing. In the studio, we would use M50s, but we're using a modified tree setup here. So I think just the delays involved with a spaced rig is more appealing to me than a coincident rig, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with a coincident pickup or a semi-coincident pickup. And we do, as you saw, we use semi-coincident pickups in section miking, and but not for mains. And I'm not here to say that it's a right or wrong thing. It's just a preference thing on my part to say that's a sound I like.
Yeah. And I think that's what's great about what we all do, which is there is no right answer, and we're all trying to figure out what we like and what works best, and we might change our mind as we do more.
I mean, another engineer could easily come in here and put a coincident or semi-coincident rig or a different sort of rig in and get great results as well. I'm the first to acknowledge that.
Okay, next question. Can you please talk a little about coordinating with various maestros? Ties in with Charlie's question above. Maybe I missed Charlie's question, but
yeah. Well, I think that we did a recording with Maestro Nelson's early on. Was a Sibelius and Wagner recording, and I think that was our trial run to see if we agreed on the sound, and if we agreed on the approach, and if we liked each other. If we were the kind, if there was a personal relationship that we were happy with. And it worked out well. We were happy with that recording. We embarked on the Shostakovich series with him. And originally it was just going to be the 10th Symphony, and we did that, and it turned out well. It wound up winning a Grammy that year. And then DG went ahead and commissioned, because we had a sponsor for these Shostakovich recordings, commissioned the rest of the symphonies, and eventually the concertos and the opera as well. But I think we deal with personal relationships, and a lot of it has to do with trust and an agreement in terms of sound quality and mixes, agreement in terms of editorial choices, and agreement in terms of the process of how we present material to them and how we make corrections. And we've been doing a series of the concerto recordings, the Shostakovich concerto recordings, recently with Yuja Wang and Yo-Yo Ma. And it all just comes down to finding a way to happily get on with people and react well to their suggestions and continue to make great recordings that we all agree on are what we want. It's entirely possible that there are musicians and conductors that I would not get on with. There are certainly some film composers that I'm friends with, but I don't work for because we don't see eye to eye in terms of film production, music production. So I think it's a personal thing.
Next question. Does live audience ever complain about balance reverb when using stage extensions versus just the permanent stage? Can the front row hear themselves as well when out on an extension?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think the players clearly don't, the back of the band clearly doesn't hear the strings as well when they're on a stage extension as when they're in the shell. I think that obviously the strings hear the brass just fine, but do the brass hear the strings so well and the percussion hear the strings so well? Probably not so much. The bigger the stage extension, the less well it translates to the back of the room, the back of the stage. I think in terms of audience balance, there's a certain, we have assistant conductors here who are very good at listening to rehearsals and making balance suggestions that translate to the audience, although it's an empty hall at the time they're doing these balances. So I think it's a matter of experience and trial and error to know for sure what to do in terms of balancing a specific ensemble and a specific piece in the hall, especially when you're on an 11-foot or 13-foot stage extension.
Yeah.
I think it doesn't automatically balance itself as well as it does if the orchestra were just in the shell.
Yeah, definitely. If you have to patch, what's involved in balancing patch and live sound with audience. I think the difference in reverb.
Yeah, the difference in reverb is primarily and the ability to use some electronic assistance to match yourselves going to and from. The other thing to think about in terms of patches, and it's in terms of editorial as well, is matching tempos. Now, we used to have to be very careful about matching tempos because if you're doing analog editing, you know, obviously you have to edit where the tempos match. Nowadays, a little less so, and luckily that's the case because we can actually, if we're close, we can adjust tempos to match for patch sessions and edits electronically, as you know. So we have that ability now that we didn't used to have. And our Bob Wolf is our editor, and who is just fantastic and very musical and kind of, you know, a magician in terms of getting everything to sound great. You know, he'll send us tempo match files occasionally where he's had to go in and just move something a little bit to make the tempos match editorially.
But sort of a similar question for the next. Oh, mastering. Do you want to talk about mastering?
A little bit, yeah. So Tim Martin, who is our friend from New Jersey, New York, currently works at the Met Opera along with David Frost. Tim's a great engineer, and Tim does our mastering for stereo only. He doesn't do Atmos mastering. Nick does the Atmos mastering. So Tim takes our mix files and gets them, you know, into all the different formats that we need, and we try to obviously give him concise mixes. But if we're producing at 32-bit 96K, it obviously has to come down to 24-bit and 16-bit, and so he has to both manually and electronically reduce the dynamic range at certain times. I find that he doesn't really wind up doing much EQ to change anything, but he certainly does have to adjust dynamic range for the CD masters and in the 9624 streaming masters that he produces as well. So we rely on Tim a lot to match from project to project. You know, we're doing 15 Shostakovich symphonies. Volume 1 needs to match Volume 3 and Volume 5 and Volume 6 in terms of overall level and in terms of sound quality, and Tim is great at making sure that happens and it's well matched and mastered.
What's your process if a soloist has their own preferred mics? We ran into that with Anne-Sophie, maybe.
Yeah, Anne-Sophie came, actually she had a producer who had microphone preferences. They weren't oddball preferences. They were, you know, I think when we did the John Williams concerto with her, we used what, 2 H's and a Coles, right?
Coles,
yeah, pair of 2 H's and a Coles on her, which is pretty, you know, it's pretty standard. He had a certain configuration which he liked, and it worked fine, and it's what she was used to. So I mean, if it's, you know, if it's something that's certainly within the realm of normal operation, we would certainly we would do whatever they want. We haven't been asked to do anything very oddball, to be honest with you. So I you know,
I think most soloists come in and sort of luckily trust us to use our best judgment and use the tools that we think will work
right.
best.
Well, what a lot of soloists do is they'll come down here after a rehearsal and listen to what we're doing. And certainly we want them to be happy. And so if there's any change in terms of microphone positioning or microphone choice or pickup or reverb level or EQ that they have, you know, they come down and listen and make comments. And luckily we've really not had any big disagreements. But soloists do come down to the studio and listen after rehearsals I think to check to see what it sounds like, which is, it's great. I'm happy to have that.
Cool. Next question is about panning. Volume only, or do you work with delays also?
Well, each individual channel is delayed. We don't pan using delays.
I sometimes do.
Okay.
Yeah.
But I'm aware of the ability to do that. And actually, I've seen Tim do it as well, to pan using delays. So do you want to speak?
Well, I like using it. For our harp pickup, we often have a high and a low.
Right.
And often I'll delay the low just ever so slightly, just to decorrelate them just a slight bit more. I
Right.
find it sounds interesting. But,
Right, right.
okay, next question. Was Shostakovich 10, 11 done with Sennheiser mains?
They were all done with Sennheiser mains.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep, all 15 symphonies.
All, well, 15 plus the chamber
Yep,
symphony,
yep.
16, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
And then additional question, how do you bridge the sample rates? That's probably going back to, I was talking earlier about we used to do 96K for the multi-track while simultaneously doing 48K for the radio broadcasts. It's without going into tons of detail, but we essentially have all the PyraMix machines, all the DAWs running at 96K and all the converters running at 96K. And then we're sample rate converting the signals that we need down to 48K, and we have separate consoles that are running at 48K, taking in those signals to match for delivery to radio or TV, whatever we need to send it to.
Right.
Hopefully that answers the question.
Right.
A question about video recording. How do you do AV recordings, any PTZ system in the hall? Yep, we have, like probably many orchestras and other organizations, the pandemic really helped us achieve having full video capability in the hall. So we have the room just on the other side of the wall here is a video control room. I think we have probably around 10 remote controlled PTZ cameras, some mounted on the wall in the hall itself, and also they'll put cameras on stands on stage.
Just portable. Yeah.
All right, I saw a note to please play something, so I think we should. Let's pause
sure.
there
Okay.
and play some music.
So what we have is Nick's going to share our PyraMix session screen. So we have the first movement of Shostakovich 15, and we have 3 little excerpts from it. First one's about a little over 2 minutes, and the other 2 are shorter. And I thought we could play a little bit of it, and then what might be interesting is to solo out some of the microphone sections, like the woodwind overheads, the percussion overheads, the mains. So you just have a chance to hear what the ingredients are in terms of this recording. So if we put up, so we'll say it's gonna be Shostakovich 15, movement 1 from the top excerpt, and it runs a couple of minutes. So I have to shut my microphone off when we do this. So it's just in terms of introduction, that's what it is. And the first bit of it will just play the mix, off the PyraMix, the automated mix, and then
and Dan, chime in. We did a test, but if anybody's not hearing stereo audio,
yeah, we want to make sure everybody gets stereo. And it's Zoom audio, so it is what it is. But it gives you at least a chance to kind of hear what we're doing.
Will do. The sound just stopped.
So I think you could probably hear me soloing groups through that, woodwinds for a little bit, strings for a little bit, brass for a little bit, which is where you said the sound cut out, which shows how little of the brass mics we were actually using, practically none. And then the main mics, the overhead Decca rig and the wides. So there's another section coming up where I can solo out a little more percussion and other things, but it kind of gives you an overall impression of how much of each ingredient we're using.
Great. If I can suggest that we continue with the presentation, and next time for the questions, open it up and let people ask them, rather than you going through this whole thing, because we'll be here the rest of the night with more questions coming in all the time.
Sure. Yeah. Well, let me play the next two clips and then we'll just go to questions. Does that sound reasonable?
Great.
Okay. So let's go ahead and share again.
We'll have people raise their hand and we'll call on them individually.
Right. So we're going to jump up to that 30. Okay. And we'll jump to just one other clip. So hopefully you can just hear the difference between the overall mix and the individual sections, and then we can jump out of this screen. So I think 40 to the end, something like that. So hopefully you could hear a little bit in terms of the proportion of main mics to close mics, and which is basically how we attain some level of detail in the picture. So I guess it's now, as Dan was saying, maybe people can unmute and ask questions, and we're happy to answer whatever.
Okay, Charlie's got his hand up, and if you'll hold on a second here, I will turn on your video, let you start your video. So Charlie, unmute yourself, please, and ask your question.
Hi, gentlemen. Thank you so much for this. Those tracks sound fantastic. I particularly love your percussion and timpani sounds. Really easy question for you. In your pyramid sessions, I notice you have woodwinds at the top instead of, say, the tree or the outriggers. Just curious what the reasoning is on that.
It's for me, it's when you read, Charlie, when you read a score and the woodwinds are on the top. Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely. As I end up following the flute piccolo line. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you read a score and you got woodwinds, and then you got horns and brass, and then you got harp and keyboard, and then you got percussion, and then you got strings. And I don't know if there's any logic to it at all, but that's kind of the way I look at it.
That's a great logic. Thanks so much. I was just so curious, and that explains it perfectly. Thank you.
All right, we'll do Rod next, and then Gabrielle. Rod?
Yeah, I was curious about, you mentioned the impulse that you do on the stage, usually under the deca tree, or the tree, if you will.
Yeah.
Personally, I go to the loudest percussion instrument on the stage and then reference everything from that, because it bleeds into all the spot mics, and that's what I want to deal with. But do you have any feelings about that?
We're looking for a way. For me, the delays are a way to integrate a bunch of mics without knowing it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yes.
And so delaying them from the tree is just a way for just logically for me, maybe psychologically, to think, okay, I'm going to be able to, there's going to be a certain amount I'm going to be able to raise this mic before anybody's going to know I'm raising this mic. And then, and at a certain level, it's going to be obvious that it's being raised. And measuring from the tree gives me kind of a predictable window of around, 6 dB or so, from the point where you don't know to the point where you do. And that's the amount of detail I can get out of the mix without people knowing I'm manipulating the mix too much.
I mean,
So that's the logic. Now, what you're suggesting is a perfectly reasonable and logical way to do it, because you're right. A xylophone is going to be in everything.
Yeah, I mean, I try to stay away with spot miking the percussion, but I go to, say, the timpani or a snare drum and do a nice hand clap, and then and then look at the way it comes up on pyramids.
Measure that to your main mics, right?
And then I can slide the tracks to so that I don't have a clap. It's just one clap.
Exactly. No, it makes perfect sense. Going from that loudest thing. Yeah.
Okay.
All right, Gabrielle, then Gary, then Alan, and I'd like Jason Graham to queue up also. You've got an interesting question. So Gabrielle, please.
I might sneak in with a follow-up question too, Dan.
Okay, do you want to do that now? Sorry, Gabrielle. Go ahead, Gabrielle.
Oh, sorry, my bad. Yeah, I wanted to ask about phasing and like arrival time, because there's a lot of microphones and I'm not sure like how you deal with that, especially if you're adding delay as effects and stuff like that.
Well, the effort is to not have any phasing or any noticeable difference in arrival time. In other words, we're establishing the arrival time as at the tree. And that's the reason for the delays, of course, is to not have any issue of timing or either timing versus phase or timing versus percussive impact to be ever noticeable is different. And I don't think in the, it's hard to tell, of course, on Zoom, but I don't think in the recording you're ever able to hear the fact that we're actually introducing delays and, basically moving the microphones to coincide with the main pickup. I don't know if that answers your question or not exactly.
I would say I would just add to that is the mics are so spaced that they're often decorrelated enough that it doesn't matter as much. But I will add to that I think as engineers we always have to be mindful and listen. And if you hear something that sounds like there's some polarity or phase issues,
Right.
always watch out for it. And sometimes, flip the polarity and see if it sounds better. And if it sounds better, then that's all we're going for. But usually it's decorrelated enough that that's not an actual issue, but you always have to just watch for it and listen, I think.
Yeah.
And are
Cool,
you
thank you.
looking
Yeah,
at
good
a
answers.
sorry, go ahead.
Yep. Thank you. Yep.
Gabrielle?
Oh, good. I'm done. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so
Okay.
much for this presentation. Yeah.
Sorry, I was trying to ask if you look on any kind of meter to note the phase of things correlating to each other or decorrelating.
When I do film scores, I do, because there's actually this is a rabbit hole, but to go down, but there's actually a reason in film score recording that you want to see correlation. We don't hear because basically what I do when I take this stuff at home and listen is I flip it to mono, and listen to make sure the balances stay put, and they do. So it's to me that ultimately is the way to check on a system that I'm familiar with.
Okay, let's let Micah ask his follow-up, and then we'll go to Gary and Jason.
That was amazing, that recording. That was just really sounded amazing. We talked about yesterday in the pre-meeting, we were able to mention how I was lucky enough to record this exact piece of Michael Tilson Thomas and New World Symphony. And so I got to know it like really well. And so I just kind of like blown away at the clarity of your recording and the dynamics. It's such a dynamic piece and such an unusual, but like really amazing piece that you guys did a great job with it. My question is actually probably easy as well. You mentioned earlier that you use it was like reverb was like Brecasty or Lex or something like that.
Yep.
What were you in this? You could, when you would hit stop, you could hear, your artificial reverb.
Right.
So I was
Yeah.
curious what the settings were and what you were using in this particular session.
Oddly enough, in the Brecasty, everybody probably knows the Brecasty world. There's a Boston A and Boston B. But we don't use those. We use mechanics, and it's a pretty much stock mechanics. We sometimes change the pre-delay a little bit, and we sometimes change the time a little bit depending on the piece. But in Brecasty world, it's based on the mechanics algorithm. And in Lexicon, it is medium R Hall plus stage, medium random Hall plus stage, I think.
Just medium random Hall one.
One, okay, one, which plus stage is on the different device. So yeah, and they're just the Lexicon world. Lexicon has a pretty distinctive sound, and it has that modulated tail and all this stuff. And it's not, you don't want that as the only reverb, I think. You want that as a character in the presentation. And the Brecasty is a much more honest, delineation of the hall, and it matches the hall very well. So probably I'd say when we're setting up these reverbs, we're leaning a little bit more on the Brecasty to match the hall, and we're leaning on the Lexicon a little bit to provide character to certain instruments depending on what they're doing soloistically. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It sounded great. Yeah, it worked really well.
Right. Thanks.
All right, Gary, and then Alan, and then Jason. Gary? Alan?
Yeah. Yep. Am I live?
You're on.
Okay, great. Hey, first of all, thanks for doing this. I'm a first-time attendee, listening just 25 miles south of you, here on the South Shore of Massachusetts. But Yeah, Boston, just south of Boston.
Just near Boston.
Since all your productions now, I guess, are in front of live audiences, how much time are you spending dealing with audience noise, and what tools are you using to do that? I assume Cedar or something similar.
Yeah, it's a great question because it is, in fact, we have to deal with doing noise reduction on these projects. And as I mentioned to somebody yesterday, I said, 2,000 people breathing make a lot of noise.
Yeah.
It's, whether they're actually making annoying noises or not. Musicians' bows tick on stands, and page turns sometimes are noisy, and their chairs creak, and we have to take those out. Now we have pretty good software these days, but and in Pyramix world, it's called Renovator, and in Pro Tools world, it's Isotope. Do pretty much the same thing. But the big key, of course, to noise reduction is listening to what you're doing, because all noise reduction will take out the music along with the noise if you're not careful. So Nick, who is an expert at this, and we have a couple of other great engineers that we use on a freelance basis to take noises out. And we take the noises out of the multi-track. We don't take them out of the mix, because we feel that but first of all, you can zero in on the noise in terms of which channel it originates from. And from that what other mics are likely to be the culprit. And of course, you can be much more selective and cleaner that way than to selectively take it out. So I'm going to turn it over to Nick to talk about that a little bit.
We could do a whole 3-hour AES presentation.
Right.
I don't know where to start, but yeah, I mean, we just to add to that, yeah, we take it out of the multi-track also because we often, the process never ends. We might get additional edit comments and stuff, and so if you take noises out of the stereo master, but then you have to do another pass, and you have to take all those noises out again. So we try and do it at the source. In Pyramix, we use a program called Renovator, which is embedded sort of in Pyramix in a really nice way that allows us to do multi-track noise reduction very easily. If you want, I can pop it on the screen, but again, it's sort of, we could spend 2 hours.
Okay. Yeah.
But it's really, takes forever. And you just sit there and you do your best to try not to do, you do no wrong or as best as you can, but there's musicians creaking as they move in their chairs. There's coughs, which especially in the Atmos world, now we have all these hall mics that we are using behind us, and it's decorrelated from the fronts, and so getting coughs out of the back takes a long time. Anyway, there's endless noises.
Yeah.
Thank you.
There's just one other point that Nick made, which originally we were talking about this, is you take one layer of noises out, and it's like peeling an onion. What's left is another layer of noises. You know what I mean? And you take those out, and what's left is another layer of noises.
Yeah.
So how far do you go? That's the people part, is we just have to make a good judgment call about getting out what is noticeable and annoying, and leaving some of the rest.
Thank you.
All right, good questions. Alan, what's your question, please?
My question may be kind of irrelevant at this point, but it involves with the broadcasts. And I'm living in Rhode Island, so I'm lucky enough to be able to pick up the HD broadcasts from WGBH. And I've found that they vary considerably in terms of the quality. So the question really is, how do you deal with the comb filtering, which you've touched on, bitrate reductions for the stereo broadcast mixdowns of the multi-channel recordings for both analog, which I guess goes out over GBH's sister station, WCRB, and streaming and the HD broadcasts. And also there's limiting and compression going on in them. So you've touched on some of this stuff, and I'm sure it's something you folks may hear. I was surprised to find that Shawn decided to listen in mono, which is probably a great way to hear comb filtering or other effects that might intrude in the fabulous work you guys are doing. I mean, I'm surprised both of your heads still haven't exploded with all the work you have to do to clean up almost 60 channels of stuff. But I just thought I'd raise that question and see how your responses were. So again, thanks very much for putting this all together. I know you guys are working the late hours like I am over here in Rhode Island. So thanks again.
Oh,
Yeah.
sure. You want to talk a little bit about radio, or
I mean, yeah, I can't really speak to the chain so much. And I'm not sure if the question is about the signal quality or
yeah, well, I mean, you know, the original material that they have and that we have is the same. Antonio Oliard is the GBH engineer, and he's great. He does a great job. He sometimes uses a slightly different setup than what we use, but it's similar. But I think ultimately, you know, in the radio broadcast world, things get mixed down to stereo, and then they go into a codec, you know, and it gets sent to the you know, encoded, compressed digitally to the station, and it gets transmitted down the line, you know, to either streaming or broadcast, you know, transmitters, and invariably there's going to be AGCs involved. You know, there's going to be gain control. There's going to be there has to be limiting if it's broadcast over the air. And what happens? It depends on how that stuff is set up. You know, in my early career, I was in San Francisco and I worked for a classical station, and we had, you know, we were very fortunate that we had a couple of engineers who were really fussy about the way the limiters and AGCs were set up. So they were pretty invisible, but not totally. And you know, I'm not sure a lot of times nowadays people are paying much attention to that.
Yeah. Well, I go back to the days when they basically had a live link from Symphony Hall, a microwave link to the GBH transmitter on
Right.
Great Blue Hill.
Right.
And I knew Bill Busick. I never met Jordan Whitelaw, who was one of the original producers.
I actually worked with Bill when I first started coming here to
Oh.
work on the Pops TV shows.
He was amazing.
Bill was
He
a great
really
guy.
managed to get fabulous sound out, and he did it basically in a minimalist approach. I think they used two stereo SM2 microphones for a
Yep.
good chunk of the recordings they did.
Yep, they did a great job.
Yeah.
And that's what you're describing is a much more purist approach, both in terms of microphone and in terms of transmission, than
Yeah.
what we have now. You know.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I think something's been lost in the process.
Well, I think it's possible to get a great version of it now. I just don't think it's inevitable. You know, and I you know, and that's just a bit of technology intruding, you know.
Yeah, and there's a lot of fingers in the process, as you pointed out, in terms of where it goes from the actual stereo mix down in your studio, which I've seen, by the way. There was a tour from the AES Boston a couple of years ago of Symphony Hall.
Right.
And it's quite a facility, and you guys have a lot to work with.
Yeah.
But it's also a lot of, as I say, your heads haven't exploded yet, so you've done well.
Well, this I'll tell you, this orchestra and a few others, but this orchestra has been extremely proactive in giving us great tools. You know, the BSO, the management, and the people that we work with have been, you know, a lot of orchestras, you know, make their own recordings, but they don't have the kind of facilities we have, and of course they don't have the hall that we have as well. So you know, there you go.
All right, good questions. Thanks, Alan. Let's go to Jason. You've got an interesting situation, you said.
Hi, and I just want to again say thanks for this. This has been really fun to. I kind of feel like we could talk war stories for a long time. My main job is working for the Tabernacle Choir and Orchestra at Temple Square in Salt Lake City. So it's fun hearing that like we're sharing techniques, similar techniques and similar issues and broadcasting and live sound reinforcement. But my question actually is I'm actually coming to Boston Symphony Hall to mix a show in June with millennial choirs and orchestras, and wanted to get your ideas in terms of mixing live there. And from what I've heard from the staff, they're telling me less is more. But I'm on your side, where the record side, where I've got, you know, for a tour that I'm doing, like with Tabernacle Choir, we've got, 80 channels of microphone out on the stage. Tell me how to mix this show. I got a 300 plus choir and a full orchestra, and that place is going to be packed. So tell me what I need to do.
And you've got a big hall to deal with at your home venue, right?
Yes, yeah. The Tabernacle's it's a 6-second decay in there, and
Yep.
you play a snare drum and you're hearing it in 2025.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's certainly having that much horsepower in the choir department is going to help you.
Yeah.
We just did an opera here in the hall, and we had 120 voice choir. It was the Tanglewood Festival Chorus, and a big orchestra.
Yeah.
And the choir didn't, when we were mixing, we got to push them a little bit. They didn't take care of themselves. Now 300 and some voices, you'll be better off.
Yeah.
And certainly in reinforcement world, you might not need too much in this hall just to strike a good balance, on your given your forces. You'll be on the big stage extension to fit that many people in. You'll be on the 13-foot extension.
Yeah.
So the only thing to think about is in terms of what we were talking about, in terms of what's going to happen to the people who are on the extension who are not being supported by the acoustical shell.
Sure.
To give that more support. This the front of house here, is Digico, and it's there's 112 channels in Steve's racks and another 12 in the recording.
Plenty of technical horsepower.
There's plenty of real estate, right?
Yeah.
To do whatever you want to do.
Okay.
I think in terms of vocal forces, though, you'll be okay.
Yeah. Yeah, and I know the music gets big too. So like my thinking is that there's going to be times when I'm going to need to get that choir over what the orchestra is doing.
Right. And
okay.
Our latest pickup, just because the choir is right up against the back of the orchestra, so of course, if you start hanging choir mics, there are also percussion mics and brass mics.
Right.
Is to choose mic patterns and positions which shadow that as much as you can.
Yeah, the idea is I think I might bring some 8040s with me, some Sennheiser 8040s, and they're discreet enough and cardioid enough to make it.
Our last pickups were cardioids, I think, weren't they? Yeah, set cardioids as well. Exactly. Yeah. All in the same ballpark that we're
okay. So if I get what you're saying, I'm going in the right direction. Less is more. Get the choir above, and I've got a soloist, and that's about it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. Yep.
Okay. Awesome, man. I wish I could just sit down and talk shop with you guys while I'm there. So
it's I don't know when are you going to be here in June?
It's June. I think I'm there like June 16th or something like that, somewhere in the middle of the month.
Yeah. I'd say hi, but I'm going to be out at our summer.
That's what they're telling me. Everybody's gone out of Tanglewood.
Exactly. Well, anyway, have a good time. The hall is great.
Thank you. Looking forward to it. I'm a former Berkeley student there, and so just looking forward to coming back home.
Right down the street, right?
Yep.
Great, thanks, Jason. Gary, and then Don, and then maybe after Don, we'll look at more pictures or something.
We have some more pictures to show. We have that slideshow. Yeah.
Great. Gary? Gary Eichmeyer? Okay, Don Rutkoff. Ask your question, please.
Okay. My question is, if you have a concert and one part of the concert is an orchestra of 100 pieces, and the other part of the concert is an orchestra of only 50 or 60 pieces, do you have to rejigger everything you're doing? Or, I mean, you have a limited amount of time to reset things. How do you deal with that when you've got two different orchestras, two different?
Yeah. Well, we aren't doing any major, mic moves in the middle of a concert. So essentially, if it were different enough, I would approach it by doing two different setups and trying to share as much as we can between the two setups. But if we need a second main system or a second Deca somewhere because the ensemble is smaller or something, I'll set up a secondary tree and use that for the other piece.
Yeah, I mean the other basically the other situation we run into is where a concerto, you have particularly a piano concerto where you've got a tree set up right above the podium, and directly behind the podium is a 9-foot Steinway with the lid up, so that your tree mics are going to basically be hearing the back of the piano lid, which is not what you want. So we set up an alternate main pickup usually when we have that. We set up either a more spaced pickup or a tree that is pushed a little further upstage, or some way to mitigate that bad positioning because of the piano. Whereas for the rest of the concert, without the piano concerto, you can use the main rig as it stands, and it will sound good. So it's a good question. The other thing that can happen in terms of stage setup is we can work with the stage manager, the orchestra stage manager, to get the seating closer for us on the smaller pieces. Sometimes that will work, sometimes not, but our stage crew here is really good, and if we explain our situation vis-a-vis microphone positions, they will often help us. Is that close to an answer?
I thought it was good.
Yes, yes, that answers, because I used to sing on stage, and you go from a chorus of 70 or 80 people, and then you go down to a chorus of 10 people, and you can't hear yourself, and all that back and forth. I sang one time in Berlin, the Bach St. Matthew Passion, and we had 250 singers on the stage, and that was quite a challenge to get everything in balance.
Yeah,
that's in an outdoor open air amphitheater.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. When you have no acoustical help from a shell or anything like that, right?
All right, shall we look at the slideshow, and then Bryce we'll pick you up after that.
So Nick is going to share. These are our archive people here in Boston are really just the greatest. And I wrote a note to them a while ago and said, what have you got? I'm sure there must be something in the archives. And they sent, a slideshow basically showing, recording setups and different personalities dating back quite a while. And so we just figured, just for fun, we would run through these slides. A lot of them didn't pertain exactly to recording techniques like we're talking about, but it shows the historically a lot of what went on. So I think Nick is going to share that.
So I'll just kind of go through this slowly. If you want to,
yeah, I mean, a little, Seiji, the room that they're in is the room that we're in now. It's the old DG room, and you can see some U-matic decks in the background, so that kind of gives you a date, and you'll get a sense of what this room was like before it was renovated. It was not very nice.
It's on stage.
Right. Yeah, there's one that we saw. Now we'll stop here. You see behind Seiji is a drape, and that's what they used to refer to as the rehearsal drape. That was often hung when the hall was empty to mitigate the high level of reverberation, and it was sometimes used in recording sessions as well. When I first started coming here to record, they would ask if we wanted the rehearsal drape or not when we're doing a setup. There's a picture that we saw previously.
It's the studio again.
Yep, same DG room that we're in now.
Slow down just a little bit, please.
Yep,
Sure.
Thanks. Again, same studio.
So Seiji was here from 73 for what, 30, however many,
Something like
37 years. So you can generally get these dates were post 73, these sessions that you're looking at.
So this room we're looking at now is the room you're in now, but with
Yep.
the previous console?
With the previous there were no consoles in the room permanently. Now every recording company just brought their own gear in. So DG would bring their gear in, Philips would bring their gear in, Sony would bring their gear in, and so forth. Now that is not the room we're in now. This is off to the side of the stage.
Do you know who that was? Was that Van Cliburn?
Yes.
Okay.
I believe that was the RCA studio setup too. They used 3 primary microphones.
Right. And I think they were U47s actually.
Probably.
Did you know who the man was on the right in that last one?
Looks like Heifetz. The right guy is Munch.
Okay.
Right. Yeah.
Heifetz on the left, Munch on the right.
Munch
Yeah,
on the
it's
right.
Munch and
Yeah.
Heifetz. That's
Okay.
Munch and Heifetz.
Cool.
So there's, not so different now than it was then. Pop setup. Little close up of the plywood they would use to mitigate those balcony overhangs.
By the way, that medallion, for those who aren't familiar with the hall, it's over the proscenium, has one word on it, Beethoven.
Yep. Hall is at the corner of Huntington and Massachusetts Avenue. Still the same. And there's an opera setup. And here's some just interesting old pictures that the archive sent.
Oh yeah, these are I guess these are early electronic cutters, but they used a gravity weight system to actually spin the tables, as I recall.
And that's wax, right, that they're cutting on?
Yeah, or lacquer. They probably
Well, that looks pretty thick.
It could be. Or then again, it could be the table itself.
Right. Here's some.
It's quite a collection of musical instruments on the wall.
Yeah,
Is that still there?
It is.
It is, yeah.
Yes.
Wow.
And there you go.
I think that's the last one.
Yeah. So, the archive has thousands of great pictures. I mean, this is just what they pulled and sent us for just to have something that went back historically, and it's fun to watch them. It's fun to look at them.
That's great. Thank you. Bryce Adams has a question, and other people can raise their hands now also, please. Bryce?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Excellent. Someone posted in the chat earlier, you two obviously have a great understanding of music from your score reading and critical listening. Do you have instrumental music backgrounds?
We both do. I'm a brass player, and Nick's a percussionist. So we both, have experience playing at not a level that we get to record, but at a high enough level that we kind of know what it's like. Know what it's like to play in an orchestra, know what it's like to rehearse and work on something, and a pretty good sense of balancing when you're listening in an ensemble, I think. And and the interesting thing in Boston for a long time, pretty much everybody that was working in management here was a musician. The guy that was our head of operations and production, for many years, horn player. The head, Mark Volpe, was the head of the orchestra. He's a woodwind player. The culture here is of musicians. Which is it's the best.
Yeah.
It's the best way for it to be.
Well, I think it's important too, because it's important to know what it feels like to be on the other side of the microphone, to really be you're fully letting yourself, I don't know what I'm trying to say, but it's part of our job is psychologists a little bit, and helping musicians feel comfortable, and helping musicians put out the best performance they can. And I think it's important to be a musician and have been in that scenario, and been under the gun of trying to make a good recording on the other side of the microphone to do it well on the other. Not to say you can't do it that way, but I think it sure helps.
Sure. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, thanks, Bryce. Gary is telling me that he can't unmute or start the video. I don't have control anymore. I've made it so that everybody can unmute themselves. So you need to go to the next to your name and the participants list, or down at the bottom of your screen, and unmute your mic and start your video. So Gary, can you do that? Okay, while you're figuring that out, let's go to Christopher Kincaid.
Hey, so my internet's not great right now, so I'm just going to talk. I had a question about the input list. How do you all decide what spots you want to throw up? Do you look at the score beforehand? Do you throw some up during rehearsals?
All of the above. We definitely look at a score and map out what we predict we would need in a score. And percussion winds up being an evolution, because the percussionists often will set up one way, and during rehearsal they'll kind of move things around depending on who's playing what. So the percussion setup is an evolution. We start out, sometimes we have to add mics or move mics around. But we know from the score, who has solos. We know from the score what some of the predominant colors are going to be. So we do, the score drives a lot of the input list choices.
And also experience recording similar music in the same hall. We kind of certainly have an advantage where we know what works and what doesn't.
Right.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. How much time do you spend in pre-production for these kind of processes?
Well, we usually go over the input list. I have a look at the score early.
And listen to recordings.
And sometimes, especially if it's a work I'm not familiar with, listen to some recordings just to get a general idea. And then Nick will do, the input list and, suggest things that we discuss and decide what we're going to do. I'd say we, start several weeks out and wind up zeroing in on it, pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks, y'all.
Yeah, thank you.
Great. Thanks, Christopher. Gary doesn't seem to be able to unmute, and I can't unmute him either. So I'm going to skip to David Houston.
Hi, thanks again for this. This is really interesting. This is really maybe a bit nerdy and very specific, but so I'm just curious about how you balance like outriggers versus your mains in terms of how you conceive of it. Because personally, one of the things I'm finding right now is that the hall I work in most is a bit tubby, particularly at the back of the orchestra. So the more we bring in the outriggers, it improves sort of the balance of reverb to direct sound, but then you start to get these negative effects of the hall. And I'm just curious, like Decca seems to want you to have the outriggers at the same level as all of the mains, whereas other engineers will say, like 20% or 60%. What do you guys, what's it like for you?
Well, the two things there's lots of things about the outriggers. First of all, the spacing off center is one factor that is a variable. And I know in film scoring, it winds up being anywhere from the outrigger being 12 foot off center to 15 foot off center, even a little more depending on the size of the group. The second thing, of course, which we have, the twins here give us pattern control, which is really nice. And I find that if you're using them as a string booster, we tighten up the pattern so that it becomes a cardioid or even a figure 8, which has the most focus, obviously. And if there's nothing coming in the backside that you care about, that can be a very useful pattern. Or if you're using an outrigger as for just width and size, you're going more toward omni or subcardioid. We tend to run our outriggers a little lower than the mains in level. And I'd say we start with subcardioid most of the time.
Yeah.
And then adjust depending on what we're hearing. But I'd say the typical outrigger is 3 to 4 dB below the tree. You know, and then the pattern depends on if we're looking for strings or we're looking for size.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah,
then,
that helps actually. That's kind of what I've been doing a little bit. In terms of using other patterns, how, I guess the question is then about bass response in the orchestra. So do you rely largely on the bass mics for that and whatever comes to the mains? Or is that a consideration when you're fiddling with the patterns of the outriggers?
well, certainly, you know, the more toward omni you go, the more low end is going to wind up migrating, you know, and anyway. In our hall, the basses show up pretty well in the mains, although we do have to boost them from time to time, especially when they're playing something fast, you know, because in a highly reverberant space, the articulation, you know, is the first thing to go. And that's partly a little bit the concept of our recording is to make sure the articulation of all the sections stays intact, you know, that we hear a good representation of what the players are doing while maintaining space and depth and all that stuff, so that the acoustic doesn't blur it too much. So the buildup of low end would definitely be a mic pattern consideration. You know, and maybe an overall EQ. I mean, we haven't talked about EQ, but we, you know, if we were to look at the mix desk and the peer mix session, you know, there's EQ on quite a few of the elements that we use. Not drastic, but shaping EQ, where we, you know, if we feel something is, like you said, a little tubby, and we certainly can run into that. Timpani can make everything sound tubby if you're not careful. You know, a little reparative EQ would not be unheard of. You know.
Thanks very much. I'll mute. I've got a car next door that's just making the worst noise. So thanks very much.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, any other questions here? No, no hands raised. Alan, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm never bashful about asking questions. Do you guys also do other things besides the BSO concerts and the pops? On occasion, I know, I guess either you do the Boston Philharmonic concerts on occasion, and I don't know, I don't think the Civic performs there. They perform across the street at Jordan Hall.
Yeah,
but you do the Philharmonic concerts
yeah,
too.
so we can be hired out by whatever organization is coming in, whether it's an orchestra or chamber group, whatever, to record for a fee, of course. So yeah, we end up doing quite a bit of stuff outside of the BSO and the pops, as Symphony Hall, as one of the best halls in the world. In fact, we have the TVs off, but tonight there was a Bamberg Symphony was playing tonight. We weren't recording that. We may, you know, be hired out to record.
Speaking of TV, that's another question. Do you actually do any recording for video broadcast or DVD productions or something like that?
We do. We used to. We were doing a bit more the last couple of years, where we were doing a series called BSO Now, which was an on-demand video, you know, presentation of concerts. We've kind of stopped doing that a little bit. Just the viewership was tricky. It's an expensive endeavor, and the viewership just kind of wasn't there at the time. But we usually do one or two sort of bigger video projects a year, either a PBS great performances or something else. So yeah, we're still doing it. It's an expensive thing to do, so it's tricky to do for, you know, every performance.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
How do you guys, well, this is the next topic you guys will have to do for another day, and that's how do you migrate from Boston to the Berkshires when you do Tanglewood?
There,
That must be crazy. Having been at both venues, I haven't been to Tanglewood in years, but I was really bummed when they started using public address systems on the lawn, which kind of turned me off. But the inside the shed, it's just an amazing acoustic for starters, considering it's virtually outdoors.
yeah,
And the performances are wonderful.
You think about how the BSO has Symphony Hall, which is one of the greatest in the world, and the Tanglewood Shed, which is probably the best 5,000 seat outdoor venue you're ever going to find, and Ozawa Hall, which is one of the best chamber music venues in the world. How do they get that lucky? You know, how does one organization have that wealth of venues? You know, it's just amazing.
Well, as a chain, I think, in terms of the acousticians, because I know Leo Baranek was involved in the Kusevitsky shed.
Right.
And I wouldn't be surprised if he had a hand in the Ozawa rehearsal hall too, or at least
Ozawa was Kierkegaard.
Okay.
As
okay.
is TLI, but all, you know, famous acoustician, obviously.
Yeah, and Wallace Sabine, of course, he just kind of got lucky and did a lot of research and managed to come up with he did get lucky, but I think he also put a lot of brain power into doing.
I think so too. Yeah, I think he looked at you know, he used a couple of good examples and figured out why they were good and put his science to that to this hall. Yeah.
Again, thank you guys for burning the midnight oil practically. It's going to be a late night and hopefully not an early morning for either one of you.
Oh, we got a rehearsal tomorrow morning.
Definitely an early morning.
But that's okay. This is fun. This is good. Thank you. Thanks. Great questions.
Yeah, thanks, Alan. And Keith has one too, please. Then Rod again.
Yes, so I'm just curious. You've been talking about the 15th Symphony, is that right?
Yep.
Is that the recording that would have come out in 21? Does that sound right?
That's
That
about
sounds
right.
Yeah.
Because there's one that has the first and 15th symphonies on it together.
That's it. Yeah, that's the one.
Okay, and I just wanted to say, I'm using the I can't afford a Bricasti, so I have an impulse response from the Bricasti Mechanics Hall. I've been using that for years, and now I feel vindicated now, knowing that you guys use it also.
You know, the funny thing is when you got all these boxes, they have tons and tons of algorithms and programs, and they're all different, and a lot of them are wonderful. But how we all kind of settle in to something that we like, and we just use it. You know, I mean, it's I'm as guilty as anyone of doing, you know, finding reverbs and EQs and different treatments of something I like, and I just, you know, are there other good things out there? Absolutely. But do you tend to kind of revert to what you know and like? Yep, I do.
And that's a really nice sound too.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thanks, Keith. Rod, go ahead.
Well, the subject of video came up. I found out from some of my clients who are using video that the video costs 10 times more than I do. And here I am supplying them with a sound that's similar to what you're talking about. I have Neumann and Sennheiser microphones on the orchestra and using the Neumann Solution D in the Ravenna format. So,
right.
But it's that has sped my setups very efficiently versus what I'd had to do in the past. So,
right. Yeah, it's amazing how, you know, I remember looking at a Cat 6 cable and saying, you know, there's no way you're putting 32 channels of audio down that cable. There's no way. I don't believe it. And in a way, I kind of still don't believe it, but, you know, we do it every day.
You know. Yeah. Okay. Thanks again for the presentation. Very nice.
All right, thanks, Rod. And I wanted to say that you're getting some very nice comments in the chat. People have to leave for obvious reasons, and they're very appreciative. So thank you.
Yeah, well, thanks for everyone sticking around, and yeah.
Yeah.
All right, Steve Savanu, please ask your question.
unmuting and turning on, and I don't know how to make the little hand go away, but
we see you.
I noticed you did, there's reinforcement speakers, line arrays in the hall. Do they use the reinforcement system at all on the orchestra, or is it strictly live, unreinforced?
It's unreinforced. Unless, I will give the caveat, unless there is some electronic element in the composition.
Okay.
Right. Which, does happen nowadays. But for anything that's meant to be acoustic, it's fully acoustic.
Yeah.
Fully acoustic.
I will say, yep, that's sort of for Boston Symphony, but we also do Boston Pops concerts in the same hall, and that is certainly amplified because we might have a soloist element downstage that, is a vocalist or something. It's a more sort of kind of popular
Broadway
presentation.
thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep.
Fascinating presentation, by the way, and even on the Zoom playback of the sample pieces, I'm running them through a Rupert Neve master bus transformer in my studio, and man, it made the Zoom audio sound amazing.
Thanks.
That's great. Thanks, Steve. Alan's I got a question up, but I want to ask if other people have questions first. I want to make sure that everybody who wants to ask asks. Okay, go ahead, Alan.
Mine's just basically a comment. I can recall there was a discussion or an interview of Keith Lockhart, who is the conductor of the Pops, I believe, still. And he was talking about at one point, they did bring in, I guess, a couple of rock bands, and they just let them go crazy. And they literally, he said, they blew the hall out because it's great for live music. But amplified music, if it's heavily amplified to, heavy metal, I guess the hall really just doesn't work very well because of the reverb and the capability of trapping the sound in the hall. And he said it just literally blew it out so bad that they really had to back it down and try and work with the band not to quite play so loud.
Right. Well, it's the topic of acoustic compression is that. And, every room has a certain amount of air in it. And when you exceed the ability of that air to support the acoustic energy in the room, you get compression. And, we run into it all the time in smaller rooms. So it's absolutely true. A bunch of big amplifiers in this room would be an unhappy situation. And true in a lot of concert halls, even though you're dealing with, well beyond 1 million cubic feet of volume, it's still not enough.
Okay, Gary, who couldn't talk to us earlier, has just a simple question. Who does the Atmos mix? I can hear the soundstage wider than the front corners of my room with my recordings. Do you mix for that in Atmos?
Do you want to? Nick's been doing the Atmos conversions of these mixes, so I'll let him speak about that a bit.
Yeah. Let's see. I can hear the soundstage wider than the front corners of my room. Well, I don't know where to start with that. We're not doing anything fancy, I guess, in our approach. I know of other people that are doing sort of some approaches to make the soundstage even wider than what it is. We're sort of mixing for speakers here and not panning, we're panning in the normal LCR front. We have a 7.1.4 setup and not a 9.1.4 where you can certainly get wider.
The 9 format does give you increased width in the front, and it is a standard Atmos, one of the standard Atmos formats, the 9.1.4s. The 9.1.6 actually is a standard format.
So I'm not sure, and maybe is this Gary's question? If you want to be a little more specific, I'll try and answer as best as I can. I'm not sure exactly where to go with that, but I'm happy to try.
He's going to have to type it in.
Okay. We're lucky to have such a great hall, so we record these surround and hall mics and top mics, and the acoustic quality of those pickups is very, very good. So we're able to take our stereo mix and expand that to basically an LCR, modifying the reverbs a little bit, and to add the side, rear, and top mics judiciously and balance that in, and to get the sense of being in the hall more. And it works really well. I mean, it's a very flattering sound, and good representation of the orchestra in the hall.
And while you're on a question asking who does what, who produces these sessions that you're recording?
I'm the producer, and Nick and I consult about the setup, but Nick basically handles all of the original recording, the setup and the original recording. I basically choose the performances and the takes and give it to a Bob Wolf, who's the editor, who does all of the fine tuning and editing. And then we basically give Bob a duplicate set of audio so that we can basically mail ourselves sessions back and forth. So Bob, we have same audio that Bob has. So Bob can edit, send us a session, we can listen to it here, we can make notes, send them to Bob. Bob can change the EDL and then send it back to us. So we don't have to ship audio around unless there's a speed change or a pitch change or something like that. We can basically duplicate the audio and then move the EDL back and forth. So Bob does the editing. He runs it by me first, and then I give him notes, and then it comes here, and we run it. We make a mix. I do the mixing along with Nick in post-production. We run the mix by the artists. We get their notes. We make edit changes and mix changes. We run it by them again, and that's usually the point at which we get approvals. I'd say the typical is maybe 3 mixes.
Yeah.
Occasionally more, but 3 passes plus notes in between is probably the typical thing. And then we send it to Tim Martin for mastering, who then gets all the codes and formats and sends it to DG.
Great, thank you. I'm not seeing a further elaboration of that question.
There is a question, yeah, about where we'd put Atmos mics over the orchestra. I could
yes
jump into that, Dan, if you'd like.
Yes, please.
Yeah, so we're specifically talking about height mics, I guess.
Right.
We're using Omni mics, probably about 18 feet high, maybe
18 to 18.
Hard to measure.
20.
We don't have a stick that goes that high, so we sort of eyeball it, but it's probably around 18 feet. And it's sort of a square, sort of around the conductor's podium. So inside, the fronts are inside the orchestra,
right,
kind of between the strings and woodwinds, and then the rears are sort of like outside of the strings, more towards the hall and the audience. Then those are for heights, and then of course we talked about the surround and hall mics a little bit earlier, but an additional sets of
sides
omnis,
rears, right,
yeah, for sides, and additional further pair of omnis for the rears, and those are just panned discreetly to all of those speakers to make the Atmos, and then we are adding a little bit of extra reverb to sort of tie it all together
to make it sound like one. We're basically in this Atmos mix, we're not dealing so much with objects as we are with the bed. However, because the original Atmos program only had two height channels and we want 4, we just turn the tops into objects. So we wind up with basically a 7-1 plus 4 objects for the heights, and that winds up being the format that we've used so far. Now, obviously, there's a lot more flexibility, and you could make every single channel of your multi-track an object if you wanted to, but for given it's classical music and we're in a great hall, we don't see the point in doing that.
All right, thank you. Mac Perkins has a question.
Well, first off, I'd like to thank you for the presentation, and your recordings are amazing. I'm fairly familiar with the hall, having grown up in Boston, and I worked for WCRB in 65 and 66. So I was Richard Kay's sort of gopher, and he was an amazing guy to work with.
Cool.
I was just curious if if the broadcast booth up on the sidewall still exists.
Yep, it sure does.
It does.
Yeah.
It's
I remember being crammed in there with, I think, 3 Ampex machines.
yeah, it's still there and it's still used. Luckily not a bunch of analog machines anymore. You know what I mean? But yeah, I mean that's a secondary control area when for radio when they can't use the downstairs room.
Well, you've come quite a way since then.
Yep. Yep. And yet, the people that were engineering back then, I know Bill Busick was mentioned and other people that were at GBH, Vern Coleman and Will Morton were all really great engineers who worked, did the TV and the audio for the FM radio in this hall and were fabulous, did a great job. So, you don't, like I said earlier, we've been preceded by a lot of great people.
Well, it's pretty simple. It was WCRB and they were doing the transcriptions, and I remember babysitting Ampex machines in there a fair amount. I think that there were either 2 or 3 Neumanns hung across the front.
Right.
And then one in the back, I think, at one point. And there was a 3-track machine, if I remember rightly, and I have no idea what the track layout was. But
right, I do remember early in my time here seeing an SM2 hanging out in front, which is basically a pair of KM56s.
Sure.
Which
I don't know. Yeah,
nice.
65 is a long time ago. So anyway, thank you a lot.
Oh, thank you.
I'm glad to see that the things are in good hands there.
All right, thanks, Mac.
Yeah.
Rod and then Alan, please.
Well,
Yeah.
okay,
Hey,
I
Rod.
noted. Oh,
I was just
noted-
if I can jump in real quick. I see Gary's follow-up question. I just feel like I should respond to that because I missed
Good.
Gary,
I didn't
sorry.
see it.
Just quickly, I think he said he's hoping Atmos mixes are wider than LCR, and I think and hopefully I'm thinking of this the right way, but our presentation is the orchestra is in front and not sort of wrapped around. We're not inside of the orchestra, so we're not sort of pulling the orchestra to the sides or back.
Right.
Certainly you could do that. It's an approach.
Well, we do, and we do that in film score sometimes. And so it is in Atmos approaches for different applications. We do that. We swing parts of the orchestra further out and tend to be more enveloping. But in this situation, we don't. We kind of leave the LCR picture up front.
Anyway, sorry to interrupt you, Rod.
Okay, well, I noted earlier that you were discussing shipping EDLs back and forth. That was the fantastic thing about the Pyramix, is that 2 people in different locations can have the original files, and then you swap back and forth with just a simple email and an attachment with the entire
Right.
EDL to look at the changes and say, well, it should be done this way, and
Right.
and then I ship another one back to them and said, well, how about this? And that's what's so fantastic about it, rather than trying to upload for hours and hours sound files.
Right.
So,
And even if you do a rough mix, you can ship that very quickly to someone to listen to and get their approval or their ideas about that. It's the sort of thing where you would have otherwise had to wait a few days each way, and now you wait a few minutes each way.
Yeah.
It's pretty great. I mean, it's when it was all happening at first, it was a little bit overwhelming, but now it's just we just do it every day, as you know. It's the way we do it.
thanks again.
All right, Alan.
There we go. Got to click the button hard enough. I'm sorry, I don't mean to hog all the questions. And this really isn't so much a question as a result I came up with. I heard a really fabulous performance many moons ago of Kazuyoshi Akiyama conducting the Rachmaninoff Second Symphony. I got so excited about it when I lived in New Hampshire. I got tickets and went down the next concert to hear it. But I discovered that there is a huge archive, as you've mentioned, but it's also a lot of the audio files are accessible currently in MP3 format, which is unfortunate. But maybe you could convince them to at least maybe start dubbing some of this stuff in FLAC format. But they have a huge archive of recordings that goes back probably at least to the start of the broadcast, and some of them go back beyond 1950 into the Kusevitsky stuff. And it's fabulous, and it's available. They've, I guess, kicked around maybe monetizing it, but they didn't charge me anything to get a hold of a copy of the Akiyama recording.
Right.
And I just wanted to throw that out and mention it, because if other people are interested in hearing some of the history, or even a concert that may have taken their breath away, which happens quite often in Symphony Hall, they might be interested in chasing it down. It's on the BSO website, and it's an easy thing to access and contact the people. They may take a while to get back to you because they're pretty busy, but they're busy archiving all the stuff you guys do.
The archive here is really fabulous. I mean, they really, and they have recordings dating back that far, and like we showed you all the pictures. I mean, they have amazing stuff in there.
Yeah, they have programs and obviously photographs as well, and it's an amazing pile of stuff. Again, they have a crew that really knows what they're doing with that stuff.
Right, it's true.
That's wonderful. Thanks, Alan. Joe?
Yeah, I just had a quick question about the use of ribbon microphones. I didn't see any actually in those lists. And just if you could talk briefly about why ribbon microphones may or may not be the best thing for such recordings.
Well, I'll talk, and then I'll let Nick. Nick. I like ribbon microphones, as you know. And when we record, for instance, a violin solo, when we did Anne Sophie, we used a Coles in the center of the trio of mics on her. We just did a Yo-Yo Ma recording where we used a Royer SF1, which is actually a very nice sounding small ribbon mic on Yo-Yo. The thing about ribbon, there are two things about ribbons that we have to think about, aside from the fact that they're generally low gain, and yes, there are ways around that, but generally they're low gain. One is how big they are, and we do get pushback from our bosses and presenters when we start putting up mics that are large and visible. We can get away with a Coles on a violin solo every now and then and not get too much pushback, but I think if we were to put up a lot of ribbon mics that were large and visible all the time, we'd probably get a little bit of pushback on that. Secondly is the robust nature, and ribbons can be sensitive to wind and abuse. And Nick has had that experience a little bit. I'll let him talk about just failures, things that don't wind up being robust enough to live, at Tanglewood, for instance, out in the weather, and so sometimes it's that consideration. Sonically, if I had my way, I'd probably have half a dozen ribbons out there all the time, on brass and violin solos and all the things you would normally use ribbons on. I would be happy to have them, but for all those reasons, we've tended to shy away from them, even though we, our friends at GBH have a nice mic cabinet, and we can get ribbons from them if we want to use them.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just add the practicality. I mean, my job is to make sure things always work and sound the same from concert to concert. And with all the events that are happening at Symphony Hall, sometimes I might be doing 3 separate orchestral events throughout a day, one in the morning, one in the afternoon, one at night. And each of those might be a 50 or 60 microphone setup. And we're tearing down and rebuilding and tearing down and rebuilding. It's just a practicality of having tools that I know I put it up and I plug it in and it's always going to work. And it's going to sound exactly the same way it sounded the day before, with us handling it roughly, stagehands handling it roughly, that sort of thing. So just from a practicality standpoint, I avoid them if I can, even though I do like the way they sound.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thanks, Joe. Rod and then Janie.
All right. Well, you mentioned earlier in the presentation you're using Sennheiser Twins and MKH 800s. I've run those head to head with ribbon microphones, and they are almost exactly the same sound, with the exception that the Sennheisers, the high end continues on, whereas, but even the proximity effects of those the Sennheiser 800s and the Twins seem to be almost the same as a ribbon.
Yeah.
So
yeah, the Sennheisers really do perform well, don't they? I mean, they're and the fact that the Twins have the two outputs and give you that pattern control after the fact is, for us, it's really attractive. It's a good thing.
Okay, thanks, Rod. Janie?
Oops. Apparently I can't start my video because the host has stopped it. But anyway, so, okay, there we go.
You can.
Well, okay, there we go. Cool. So, yeah, I just had a comment, really. I was just going to say if they ever tell you that the mic on the violin is too big, just tell them be glad it's not a Stroh violin.
Okay, any other questions? All right, do you have a summary that you'd like to end this fantastic presentation with?
Well, it's just the big thing is to thank everybody for hanging around with us and asking such great questions. I mean, it's it was fun to present and even more fun to chat with people and getting a bit of history and questions about what they do. And so thank you all for having us, and thank you for sticking with us all evening. And it was really enjoyable. So, and thank you, Dan, for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
It's a pleasure. And speaking of being together, it doesn't ever make any sense to me to get a group of people like this together who love audio and are from so far apart. Let's keep sharing the enjoyment. We went through at the beginning and had people introduce themselves, and I'd like to keep doing that. And I'm happy to stay here indefinitely for all intents and purposes. So if I didn't call on you earlier in the meeting, would you please raise your hand now? And we'll hear from you and go through the list. So Steve, why don't you go ahead and start? Steve Savanu.
Right. I'm Steve Savanu. I'm in Northeast Ohio. It's midnight my time. I do some classical recording. I do some live stream video. I'm the recording engineer for the Akron Symphony, and I do video for the Cleveland Pops in 2 different locations. Fantastic presentation. I learned a lot of things, and listening to your stuff sounded amazing, even on the Zoom playback. But yeah, it's always good to learn things and try some things. Kind of a fun story. We just did Bruckner's 4th a month ago, and they wanted to get the big Bruckner sound in our hall, which is not the best acoustic hall, but the backstage area had a lot of really nice kind of natural reverb. So to get that effect, we first suggested we'll put artificial reverb and just reinforce some of the orchestra, and they said no, we didn't want to do that. So we ended up setting up area mics on the orchestra, running them through a portable PA system set up back in the backstage area. And we created an opening between the top of our orchestra shell and the ceiling that moves up and down. And we basically used that backstage area like a big echo chamber and reinforced the orchestra through this PA system and let it blend in acoustically with the live sound. And we got the Bruckner sound we desired. It was kind of a fun experiment, and everybody liked it. So it was kind of
a great idea.
And there's a write-up in Front of House magazine in the last issue. There's a thing called a Showtime that shows the performance and lists all the crew people. And then the editor, George Peterson, talked about it in his opening column in the magazine. And I presented it to the Hollywood Sapphire group, how we achieved it. And it was really kind of a fun way to get that sound acoustically using electronics, but not in the way people thought you'd use it.
Right. Yeah. What a great thing. Yeah.
Yeah, it was a fun project. Of course, now they want to do it all the time. And it's like, I don't know if
That's
I want to do it all the time.
Cool. Thanks, Steve. And just in case you don't know, that background behind Steve is real. That's not he's got a club in his basement there.
That's my nightclub. It's not the angle I'm pointing at where my camera's pointing. It's the opposite side. If I turn that off,
Oh, usually it is that direction. Okay.
Yeah, no, that's the video editing suite, my analog control room behind me. So that's the and my production company is called Buford T. Hedgehog Productions, and we have a sign out in LA.
Nice.
Yeah.
Steve, you just muted. Your production company is called what? You just muted.
I heard him.
Yeah, Buford T. Hedgehog Productions.
All right, great. Thank you. Okay, Alan, where are you and what's your audio deal?
Okay,
Alan
well,
Southwick.
the photograph behind me, and it is a photograph of part of my complex in the basement of my house. And no, I don't do recordings on the Ampex AG440 anymore, thank God. I don't have to schlep it around. I did a lot of on-location work from the late 60s right up until just before or just around the conclusion of COVID. A lot of on-location classical music recordings for various community orchestras throughout the Northeast. I'm right now talking to you from a small town just north of Newport, Rhode Island. And I lived in the Boston area for a while, and my background is basically electrical engineering. I never made a career out of audio, although I look at what Nick and Shawn have done, and I'm like drooling, because way back in the day, Kevin Mostyn asked me if I'd be willing to help do stuff out at Tanglewood. He was the chief engineer and a roommate of mine at one point, but he was chief engineer at WCRB in the broadcast area. And some days I just kind of kick myself that I didn't go out there, because that might have been a different career than the one I had. But it's been a wild ride. And yes, a lot of the gear, I'm amazed, that is a Dolby A301 that's sitting on top of the Ampex electronics. And it's an old Tektronix scope that's RM, I think it's 503. It's dual inputs on both X and Y channels, and was an early version for what's now, it's a Lissajou pattern generator basically, but it's what's used a lot now in determining phasing and stereo performance versus mono, which is a vertical line generally. And it's patched into a Mackie mixer, and I've done a fair amount of digital stuff since I went digital back in, I guess it was must have been around the late 80s, because I got tired of schlepping the Ampex around.
Isn't that an Ampex mixer right above the scope?
Yeah, that baby isn't there anymore because it's developed a great deal of noise. I think it needs all its caps replaced, and I just haven't gotten around to doing it. And I've custom modified it so it actually provides phantom power too now. So, but it's their AM10, which was pretty noisy as mixers go. If you had a hot mic that would really put out a good level, it wasn't a problem. But I've as I say, it's been kind of a wild ride. It's a Heathkit audio generator above it, going way back. So I'm dating myself big time.
All right, great. Well, thank you.
One of the crazy things, just as a quick aside with the history, I happened to get a call from a guy, another producer in Boston, who's been working with the local Concord, Massachusetts chorus. And they're celebrating, I believe, their 75th anniversary concert or season this year. And by a strange coincidence, I had recorded their 25th anniversary recording on analog. And they came to me back a year or so ago and said, gee, we're celebrating this. And we have a record because we made a black disc of the Verdi Requiem. It was my first exposure to it, which I never forgot because it's quite a piece of music. But they said, "Do you happen to have the original master tapes?" And I said, "I think I do, but I don't know how well they'll play back." But I did manage to dig them out, and I was even kind of blown away. I haven't heard them for ages. They were recorded with the Ampex AM10 on the Ampex mixer, on the Ampex recorder, which is a half-track stereo machine running 15 IPS with a Dolby A301 and two Sony C37 FET mics, which are a large capsule, large diaphragm, really impressive microphones. I still have them. They developed some difficult problems, which a friend of mine modified finally. And
all right.
But that was amazing thing that went back for me too to an early days when I just had gotten started in the 70s or late 60s doing the recordings.
Oh, that's great, and thank you for being with us and sharing your
Thank
history.
you guys also for A, putting on this, and B, the hard work that I know Shawn and Nick rather, don't stop doing every day and every night and every morning. Thank you
Definitely.
again, guys. Great job.
Definitely. Thank you. David Satz, where are you? What's your audio deal?
Hi, is my level okay?
You're good.
Thanks. I really want to thank the presenters for a lot of things. This means a lot to me because I was a student at New England Conservatory and auditioned for the Boston Symphony, didn't get in, but my teachers, I mean, most of the instrumental instructors at the conservatory are members of the Boston Symphony Orchestra. So I was frequently at concerts in the hall to hear, and sometimes friends of mine got substitute positions in the orchestra, and some of them became full-time members. It's really interesting to see how you do it. The recordings that you played for us is gorgeous. And that's, despite whatever Zoom was doing to it, that is fantastic. And I really congratulate you on everything you're doing. I do have a tiny technical question, because on your microphone list for the trumpets and trombones, you showed MK5, which is a switchable pattern, Schoeps, Cardioid, or Omni. It sounds a little different from the MK2H or anything else, and a little different from the MK4 when you switch it to cardioid. And I was just wondering whether you actually switch patterns on it sometimes for different situations, or whether you like one or the other, but you just prefer it to the stock available Omnis or whatever.
In that case, I think we would have, well, they were used in cardioid, and probably if we had extra MK4s, we would have used 4s. It was just a limitation of at that point in time we were short mics, and that was a good a decent sounding mic that we could put in, but they were cardioid in cardioid.
And as you could probably hear when I soloed, we were using very, very little of that.
Yeah.
So we knew, because to be honest with you, the MK5 is not my favorite Schoeps capsule. And remember they used to make an MK6, which was also a switchable capsule, which you know, I mean, because of Schoeps, mechanical pattern selection, they really do work great as a single pattern microphone and not so much as a switchable pattern microphone. But so the MK5s are what we had, and I knew in that setting we wouldn't need much of it, and so there you go. but yeah, exactly.
Okay, thanks again.
David, would you please take a minute and tell us of your Schoeps connection? Because that is fascinating to me.
I've been their main translator from German to English for over 40 years, and I did a lot of research into their history as a company. I'm going there in 2 weeks for a month. Yeah, I do consulting and translating and editorial work for them.
I have CMT 501s out in Hollywood, which I actually use all the time. you
So
know,
you like the 3-pattern capsule?
yeah, I mean, they work fine in that application. And again, there I use them as, like horn and brass overalls.
Mhm.
They're used lightly, but they sound good. And it's a stereo mic. It's the CMTS 501s.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So,
I'm going to be recording with a pair of those this weekend.
so they're great.
Okay.
And David has spent weeks and months over many years in the Shep's archives at the factory, trying to save the history of the company, which the company is little interested in saving, apparently, almost.
Well, they know better now, but for many years they didn't preserve their records very well. And
Well, thank you for doing that.
Yeah, thanks, David. Joel. Oh, sorry, I skipped Charlie. Charlie, please. Go ahead. Charlie
Hi
Post.
again.
Hi. Where are
am,
you? What's your audio deal?
yeah, what am I? Human and Homo sapien. And I'm originally from New York. I've been in Chicago about 10 years as the recording engineer for Chicago Symphony Orchestra. Prior to that, I worked with Nick alongside Nick and saw Shawn lots, although we never actually worked. I don't think any of the three of us have worked together in the same room at the same
I was
time.
going to say it's in the same room, right?
Exactly. I assisted Shawn on some mixing in Ozawa Hall at Tanglewood, and that was the extent of it. And then tried with limited success to fill his shoes for a recording that I happened to win a Grammy for because he was able to rescue at the mix stage is my my outlook on that situation. But I've had the fortune to know these two personally, which is fantastic, and I'm very grateful for that and for this presentation because I get to see sort of the evolution of the recording of the BSO and all this wonderful work you're putting out. I have one quick technical question for you all, which is where are you monitoring at these days in terms of decibel level in the control room?
It's a good question. I will tell you that, film level is 85 dBc per speaker, blah, blah, blah. I never, ever, ever monitor at that level. Pretty much in film world, I monitor at 75. And then I monitor the surrounds and rears down 3 from that. Because in a small room, the proximity of the speaker causes them to sound too loud. I would guess that in this room where we're sitting right now, I probably listen maybe at 78 or something like that. I mean, it says the setting says 80. I'm not sure it actually is 80, but it might be close to 80.
Well, that's it's around probably between 75 and 80.
Yeah.
And certainly sometimes for playbacks for artists, we might go a little
For
louder,
artists, but
trying not
as
to.
Nick knows, when I set the level when I come in the morning, and I never ever change it. I never adjust the monitor level once it's established. I think it's an easy way to really fool yourself into what your mix sounds like. Yeah.
No, that's great. Thank you. I had a feeling neither of you monitored loudly, which is, great because we're saving our hearing and hearing the details we need to hear and striking that balance. So
absolutely.
Thank you so much. It's so late there. I hope you're set up for rehearsal tomorrow isn't too early.
Well,
I'll be there early. Shawn won't.
Yeah. Nick will beat me in by a little while.
Yeah. Nice to see you, Charlie.
Great to see you. Thank you.
Thanks, Charlie.
Thanks, Charlie. Joel Crawford, where are you? What's your audio deal?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
All right, I'm Joel Crawford. I'm in Cincinnati and I work with the other CSO, the Cincinnati Symphony Orchestra down there. So thank you guys for the great presentation. Really enjoyed it. Always happy to learn new tricks from colleagues in the field. Just one real quick question. I've been looking into Renovator for some time now, but the documentation is super old. Is that supported by PyraMix 14?
It is, yeah, and there isn't much documentation, but it does work. There's sort of a little trick to get it to work with PureVix. But yep, it works and it works great. I definitely recommend Renovator.
Yeah, I've been looking between Cedar and Renovator, and everyone keeps saying just pay the extra, get the Renovator. And then I look at it and it's like, well, this is 20 years old. So, you know.
Yeah, it is funny. It works. It looks old, but it sounds new, I guess is a good way to put it. It works really well.
All right. Well, thank you guys. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, you bet.
Thank you.
Joel,
Yeah.
what do you do with the CSO?
I do all the broadcast recording, archival recording. We have live broadcasts coming up here in a couple of weeks, that kind of thing.
Great. All right. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, I'm going to comment. I use Renovator as well, which I'm comfortable with. So.
All right. Shelby, where are you? What's your audio story?
Hi, I'm based in Charlottesville, Virginia. I'm primarily a mix engineer, mastering engineer. I do a lot of collaborating with a couple of classical recording companies based in Chicago, Peckham Media Productions and Atlas Arts Media. I'd say about half of what I do is classical music and another half is folk, acoustic music of various types. And so far, I've pretty much only done chamber music in the classical world, and so I'm hoping to get more into large ensembles. So this has been really great. I've just been taking it all in, and I know I'm gonna have to go through the recording again. I'm really glad that you guys you were so generous and you've hung in there for over 3 hours, and it's after midnight now. So. Yeah, we all really appreciate that. So thank you.
And thank you for joining us. Are you an independent there?
Yeah, I own River Rock Records. That's my company.
All right.
But yeah, a lot of my work comes through Atlas and Peckham Media Productions.
Cool. Well, thank you for joining us. You were the last. Oh no, Robert, go ahead. What's your audio story?
Oh,
Robert?
yeah. Well, I want to throw it I'll include it with a question. I worked at the Met before COVID for 10 years, and I was there for the transition between Jay Sachs and David Frost and Tim. And I met you there one time, Shawn, and I never thought I would have a chance to ask you this question, but there was a huge transition between Jay's style mixing and Tim and David and the detail factor. And I've been hearing you talk about that and sort of accent mics and things. And I would say probably Jay used less of those, but I wonder if you have any thoughts about sort of that. Some people describe Jay's style as a little more flattering, perhaps, but the current style is for detail, and what people want is that detail. What do you think?
Well, I think that's a great question. And I know Jay, of course, and Tim and David as well. And I think Jay, if I were to say anything about Jay, his mixes were one, I think they were more flattering to the singers, and two, they were probably more based on an emotional approach to the music than and not to say that Tim and David don't, but that Jay was probably more in that direction. And just having worked with him a few times, I know that he was like that. So I think that Tim and David are, they wanted to take it in a little different direction, and that's what their choice is. And I think probably in the orchestra, especially, the miking is a little more extensive than it was with Jay. They're also doing for their HD stuff in the theaters. They're doing a surround mix, which is a different thing as well. That different from what Jay was doing. But like I said earlier, I'm not really here to say best or worst or anything. It's just a different approach. It's just a different set of ears on the music, which is completely valid. And I think Jay's fantastic, and I wouldn't ever say that what he did was wrong or bad. It's just different than what they're doing now.
I was lucky enough to sit for many years right next to Jay and then right next to Tim and David. And it's so different, and it's all still great. And you can feel it the same. And you can say it's more flattering to singers. Well, maybe maybe that detail is more flattering to the music and the composer in some way.
Yeah, it's completely a personal choice thing. Yeah.
I have one anecdote. One time I said to Jay, I said, watching your mix is like watching somebody land a 747 for 4 hours straight. And he looked at me and he goes, yeah, except here, the only people that are in danger are the singers.
Yeah. Jay was great. He was, yeah, absolutely.
All right, that's a great story. Thanks, Gordon. Don, where are you and what's your audio story?
Hi guys, I'm living in San Diego. I'm a music lover. I'm not an engineer, so once in a while I ask questions that are kind of ignorant, but that's the way it goes. Like when you guys mentioned the DG room, my first thought was, yeah, the Deutsche Grammophon room. But then I thought, why would Deutsche Grammophon have a room in Boston Hall, in Symphony Hall in Boston? But I guess that's who was the recording contract with the symphony right now, is probably DG, not RCA.
The DG room actually was put in when Steinberg was here.
William Steinberg?
But DG had a contract with the orchestra for a while, and they put wiring in. They built this room. They connectorized it so they could bring their remote kits in, and it just became slang in the hall that it was the DG room. That's what they called it. Everybody else used it, of course. It wasn't just the DG room, but it was called the DG room.
Well,
And it's been called that for so many years now that even though it's no longer the DG room, everybody still calls it the DG
say,
room.
where are you? Say we're in the DG room.
Yeah. Well, I lived in Cleveland for a little while. I went to a few concerts at Severance Hall, and as I recall, the acoustics there were pretty nice. And I think Severance Hall looks sort of like Symphony Hall in Boston. It's a long U shape, not a wide. But then I lived in the San Francisco area for a while, and I went to concerts at Davies Symphony Hall. And I went there even after the famous or infamous Kierkegaard associates went in and remodeled Davies Symphony Hall. The acoustics still suck. They have these big lucite panels that come down from the ceiling, but the hall seats about 3,000 people, and it has about 27 billion cubic feet of volume, I think. And the acoustics even afterwards were just horrible. And a few hundred feet away was the War Memorial Opera House, which was beautiful acoustics. And there's a little theater called Herbst Theater that seats about 800 people. And there's a performance group there, San Francisco Performances, that brought in people like Andre Watts and Dawn Upshaw and Evelyn Glennie and David Russell when they were first starting their careers. And beautiful, great acoustics for chamber music. And I'm a record collector. I'm a vinyl junkie. I don't think I'm going to go to Dolby Atmos anytime in the near future. I've been spending a lot of time recently reviewing the thousands of albums that I've culled out of all the thrift stores. And here's one that I listened to yesterday. It's one of these old reproduction labels. The singer, the tenor, his name is Christy Solari. He was born in 1894, died in 1974. The label is OASI Records, a product of the Amir Oasi Corporation. These are Columbia Electrics from 1927 and 1928. And some of them sound as if they were recorded by you guys yesterday. That's how good some of these early electrics really are.
Right.
So that's what turns me on.
Right. Well, that's great. That's great. I agree with you about Davies, by the way. I went to school in San Francisco, and I'm familiar with the Opera House. And I know lots of the San Francisco Symphony musicians because I live across the bay. I completely agree with you about Davies. It's unfortunate.
Yeah, no, there was one other recording venue in San Francisco, and I have both RCA albums that were recorded there. Richard Gump's Department Store down in Union Square. I have the Guggenheimer Sauerkraut Band, Volume 1, music for non-thinkers. They take the Rodin statue of the thinker, and they put earmuffs on them. And Gump put together this pickup orchestra of about 16 people, and they were from San Francisco Opera, San Francisco Symphony, and it was a brass band, and they did these spoofs of the German brass music. So the Guggenheimer Sauerkraut Band. everybody's last name is either Schmidt or Schmitz. And recorded by RCA. Sounds great. Oh, another recording that was made in San Francisco was the Pocket Bach. A guy who played harmonicas transcribed a bunch of Bach organ works onto 4 or 5 different voices for different harmonicas. He recorded them in his living room on Geary Avenue, and he did it in the middle of the night, and he had to do it in between the 38 bus run, the number 38 bus line. So, but it's on Angel Records. It shows the rear end of a woman with a harmonica sticking out of her pocket. And again, the acoustics are great. Hearing Bach played on harmonicas. So yeah, that's there's something about music that just lights us up.
Yep.
You mentioned Severance Hall in Cleveland. I recorded Cleveland Pops Orchestra there, archive audio and video. And the orchestra shell has got at least foot thick walls, and it's just a massive structure, and the acoustics in that room are amazing.
Yeah. And that's a great orchestra. That's the BSO is great. So is the Cleveland is a great orchestra.
If I can throw one more item in here,
Okay.
I don't have Sirius XM in my car right now, but I've suggested to Sirius several times that they add another classical music channel, and it would be called the Great Five, and it would be Boston Symphony with Munch, New York with Bernstein, the Cleveland with George Sell, the Philadelphia with Ormandy, and the Chicago with George
Schulte.
Schulte, yes.
Schulte.
Yes. Yeah, because I'd love to have a channel on Sirius Radio where 24 hours around the clock, that's all you get is those 5 orchestras under those 5 conductors. It would be a very popular channel on Sirius XM, but they ignored my suggestion.
Were you mentioning Georg Schulte? Yeah, thank you.
All right, Gordon raised his hand here. You got something else, Gordon?
Yeah, greetings from San Diego.
Hi.
My audio gig came a roundabout a long way. I actually started as a biomedical photographer in Houston, and I was always very frustrated with the quality of recordings. So next thing you know, I was volunteered to be the audio guy as we shot medical films, medical videos, and multimedia shows. So that's how I got my start. I basically went from there and did a lot of volunteer work, and then continued to do a lot of commercial sound work. In my old age, I actually retired about 6 years ago and started volunteering with the Spreckles Organ Society here in San Diego. Fortunately for me, the organist Raul Prieto Ramirez is an audiophile like me, so we put our heads together and decided that we were going to significantly upgrade the archiving and recording of our performances. So I went out and with the help of a few of our trustees, we wrote some pretty big checks and basically bought a Pyramix system. And so we've been recording and archiving all of the major concerts we do using a Pyramix system and just having a ball doing it. I've learned a lot. I was the geek asking the question of balancing the organ and the orchestra earlier, which is a never-ending challenge. And I just wanted to say thank you to everybody today. This has been like, graduate school number 2 for me. It's interesting, the organ, we actually never amplify the organ. We don't need to. It plays at about 126 dB when you're up on the stage. And so it doesn't need help. But whenever we bring visiting soloists, which we do on a regular basis, we always have to work with them. And we've had everything that you can imagine. We've had mariachi bands, we've had violins, we've had concertos, we've had flugelhorns, we've had one of my favorites, Richard Conte, who plays the Wanamaker organ normally, and Andrew Ennis, who's his associate, who's both an instrumentalist, organist, and flugelhorn player, have come. And so we have a lot of fun, but kind of balancing out kind of interesting combinations of organ and other, I'll call it organic symphonic music. This year we're going to have a 36-piece concerto style symphony in about 2 months, and I'm kind of going to school learning kind of what do I need to do that and do a really nice job. So it's a lot of fun, and looking at your mic list and listening to you guys talk today was fantastic. So anyway, now it's a hobby.
Cool. Gordon, are you part of the San Diego AES section?
No, I'm not, but I think I'm going to join. So I've
Yeah.
had couple people, in fact, kind of twisting my arm, telling me I should. I go to NAMM, and I'm aware that it's out here, and I ought to.
What you're doing sounds like a great AES meeting. That would be fun to see in person.
And it would be, actually, I'm prepared to do it. This is funny. About right before COVID, the San Diego Music and Audio Society invited me to come do a presentation to them. And so we put together a presentation. In fact, the impetus for the presentation was that I had been interviewed by Copper Magazine, who's, I don't know if you know Paul McGowan, but he owns Octave Records and PS Audio. And so his editors interviewed me, and then I had him interview our curator and our organist, and just really kind of talk about what we do. And interestingly enough, the Spreckles organ is a symphonic organ. It was built in 1914, and John Spreckles realized at that point in time the symphony in San Diego is 4 years old. And his comment was, if we're going to have people listening to the symphony, we're going to have to find a way to get them introduced to it. And so the organ has always had free concerts. So we've been doing free concerts for 110 years. And I always say we're like the seed. We basically create the music fans that go and fill up San Diego's opera and symphony and, all the other fun things around here. We have a chamber group and so on. So we have a really strong music tradition here, even though I'd say it's a fairly small city in terms of artistic richness, especially compared to LA, Chicago, Boston, New York, that kind of thing. So anyway,
that's great.
Starts as Spreckles.
That's great. Steve Barsotti is the chair of the section, and I'd be happy to put you two together.
I would love it. Yeah, I'd appreciate the introduction.
Okay, great. I'll make a note of that.
Okay, thanks, Dan.
Get you guys together.
Gordon,
Thank you.
Chuckling out about his comments regarding the organ concerts made me think of a rather unique place. If you're ever out in Mesa, Arizona, there is a place called Organ Stop Pizza. And yes, it's a pizza parlor. And
they should know all about it.
Functioning Wurlitzer organ in the world in that pizza parlor. And it's quite an experience to go have a pizza, sit down on one of the benches, and listen to this monstrous beast, which they have built the building specifically around the organ. And it's quite an adventure, and they will take requests, which is even more interesting, although I couldn't get the organist last time I was there to do the Vidor Toccata. He wouldn't do it. But he said he'd heard it, and he was thinking about it.
That's great.
Yeah, I'm really aware of that organ. So Dale Sorensen is our curator, and he actually is friends with all those. There used to be a point in time where there were about 100 of those around the country, and sadly they all kind of rolled up and gone away. And sadly, the same challenge is happening to the theater organs these days, and so on. It's tough, and it's expensive to take care of them, and it's a kind of a crazy business. But my granddad was an organist, and I grew up, so I'm definitely a dyed-in-the-wool fan. So.
Yeah, I've done recordings for Rogers pipe organs in churches.
Okay.
For their videos, and they're doing these hybrids. They're Infinity hybrid. It's got MIDI control, and they can actually integrate MIDI with electronics, and they can integrate MIDI with controlling actual pipes. And we did a couple projects with them. And the video, and of course the video people are in there, and the organist is playing, and there's these camera guys are running around, and they're making all kinds of noise and stuff. And so then they get all the video stuff done, and then they chase everybody out, and then I set up and I record. I'm going to record the guy playing. I said, well, how are you going to play that piece exactly the same way you just played it for the video guys? He says, watch. And he pushed a button. And when he did it for the video people, he basically just recorded the MIDI track. He pushed the button, and he sat back off the console, and it just played exactly the way he played it an hour before. And there was nobody in the room but me and the organ and the organist. And we tracked it, and we set it. They sent it out, and the video people synced it up to the video, and it's on the Rogers Organ website.
That's awesome. Very cool.
Only his audio engineer knows for sure.
Right.
Yeah,
we're
awesome.
gonna say goodnight if that late for
Thank
us. And
you.
we have a rehearsal tomorrow morning, so we'll say goodnight,
Yes,
everybody.
yes. Thanks, you
Pleasure.
guys. Iron
Thank
Men.
you
Thanks
for
very
being
much.
so gracious and the great questions. Good night.
Bravo.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, you guys. Take care.
Bye.
Good night.